Okay. I think I've hit all the buttons. I've turned all the knobs. I've switched all the dials. And we are live once again for another episode of WhickTV, a cross-ideological space where we come together to talk about issues both political and cultural, from the silly to the serious. My friends, we have a show for you today. We are going to be talking with the one, the only Ukerist about a recent paper he published entitled, and I quote, "The Politics of Suicide. Miasma and Katharmos in Plato's Political Thought." Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I was going to pronounce Katharmos right. This was an interesting read. I'm very curious to talk with you today, to discuss the topic with you today. But I also wanted to talk about, before we get into that, since you are kind of a professor, I guess we'll start by you introducing yourself. Can you tell my audience, like, who are you, right?
Yeah, so you can call me Ukerist. Philip is my real name. I shared the article. I've been fully doxxed at this point. This account is fully linked to my real life name, so there's no going around that. But I got my undergrad in political philosophy, and I went to grad school for political science, which has several different subfields. My main field was political theory. The difference between political theory and philosophy is contested and not really important. But the thing to know is that political theory is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the political science profession. We deal with the normative concerns of politics. So we tend to the
When you
best
say
definition
normative concerns, what do you mean?
Yeah, the best definition I've found is that we study the concepts and categories that we use to evaluate political actors, institutions, and communities in terms of obligations, right? So the difference between the sort of descriptive political science my colleagues do and the normative political science that I'm concerned with is they deal with facts on the ground, is statements. Donald Trump was the 45th president of the United States. Those are things we can accumulate, and they're facts about the world we can learn, and we can learn some really interesting things that way. But I'm interested in the ought questions of just like, what should our political community look like? What these are people who deal with things like questions of justice, or what kind of constitutions are best and for what reasons, and how we justify them. What is legitimate authority anyways, if it even exists? Those sorts of questions. There's a few different ways that you can do that in political theory. Some people just live in terms of the historical. So they're not concerned about making their own normative statements. They're concerned with what have people said in the past. And so you might just do a historical excavation of what Machiavelli thought about politics. That's interesting for some people. Just straight history of ideas. What did Machiavelli think? I'm more interested in doing what is sometimes called kind of normative political theory. I and my advisor like to call it like political theory for today, which means we do use historical resources. A lot of our work is in the history of political thought, but we're also concerned with, well, yeah, was this dude right? And did he say anything worth listening to? And is there any way we can apply his ideas today? That's the stuff that we find particularly interesting. And so I don't want to denigrate the value of the historical side, but most of what I do is like, yeah, I want to read these old books. I have a lot of them. And I want to know what in them is worth sort of porting forward, what's worth criticizing, what works, what doesn't, and how we evaluate that.
Use a very probably crude analogy, theoretical versus applicable sciences, right? Like the
In a
theory
way, yeah.
behind or the application of. I
Yeah, although
understand. Oh, go ahead.
I would slightly nuance in the sense that
Like I
like
said, it's crude, but go ahead.
no, I know. I just like the descriptive people. I think sometimes the difficulty I have with them is you can accumulate a lot of data about why people vote and how we can get them to vote most effectively. But when you start treading into, well, you should vote for this candidate and here's why, or this is a policy you should support and here's why, now you're sort of in my domain, right? You're in the aughts.
You're
World.
moralizing.
Exactly. And so, yeah, I think you're right that there's a distinction, obviously, between theory and practice, but the theoretical often touches on the practical far more than people give it credit for. So, yeah.
No, that makes sense, right? There's the what is legal to do, and even if it is legal, what ought you do with that, right? Like, there's a lot of talk today about the protesters, and a lot of the defense of people calling in the cops to arrest the protesters were like, well, they were trespassing, and these universities had the legal right to call in and have them removed. And that's all well and good. I don't think I'd like to take away that legal right from them. There's very good use cases for that legal right.
Mm.
However, when we were looking at these situations on the ground, not every time you can do something means you should do something. And that, right, we touch on that in regards to the protesters, but I think that has a lot of application both to the topic of your paper and the topic that your paper touches on and addresses, which is suicide. But I
Mm.
did, since you were here, wanted to ask you about your thoughts and feelings on the latest dialogue and discourse around some of the campus protesters. Can you give us what you think?
Yeah, I'll caveat by saying I have not kept up with what each individual university is doing in terms of like how they are enforcing their policies, whether or not, and how strictly they're bringing in, outside police or campus police or whatever. And so there's a lot of details on the ground that I just have not been privy to because this is the week leading up to finals week, and I've had a lot of grading to do, and there are a lot of things I just have
Yes,
not
obviously.
been able to read. I'll say I think since like the 2016 2017 era where we had this like huge round of campus protests, the things at Berkeley, for example, with Yiannopoulos, Ben Shapiro getting run out of places, Trump issues. Universities have been trying to navigate a pretty fine line of like, yes, we are if you are a public institution, right, very different from a private institution, but if you're a public institution, protecting your First Amendment rights of your students, while also acknowledging that within First Amendment jurisprudence there are reasonable restrictions that can be placed on things like time, place, and manner of speech. And so how do we as a university conduct our business of education while recognizing that these students have the right to do what they're doing? How do we best accomplish these goals for everyone? And so in some cases, that's like letting them do sit-ins and things without obstruction. In some cases, sit-ins have been harshly punished. And as far as I'm aware, both of those can be within university guidelines. And so, for example, I think I saw a handout that Matt Walsh was praising that was given at the University of Florida. That basically just said, look, here's what you're welcome to do. You're welcome to show up, protest, hold signs, yell, shout, scream, whatever. You can't camp. You can't legally harass people. You can't assault people, et cetera, et cetera. And if you do those things, you're going to be removed. And those, as far as I understand, are the typical university policies. The difficulty that universities are having right now is that students are organizing specifically to flaunt those policies in a way that makes it hard to punish, right? If 100 people rush the quad and all set up tents immediately, it's really hard to stop them from camping if that's against the quad policy. And so that's the goal, is to provoke outrage, provoke eyes on it. Yeah. So I guess I think it's a situation that is so complicated and interwoven in the history of American higher education that it's difficult for me to want to like rule from on high about it. I'd want to like look at like each university, is it public or private? What policies did they have in place? How have they been enforced in the past? Are they enforcing them differently against these protesters for this particular reason? Because that's an accusation I've heard, right? If they were protesting anything else but pro-Palestine, that the university would have been laxer on them. Like if that's true, obviously, that's bad. And if they're punishing them more harshly for protected speech, that's bad, and they should be sued, and they should be hashed out in the courts. But at the same time, I think that some of the protesters have been alleged to engage in conduct that goes beyond the bounds of just pure free speech, and I think universities have a responsibility as institutions of education to ensure that they can carry on their business within the bounds of the First Amendment if they're a public institution, and their own policies
Sure.
internally if they're an institution. Yeah.
Sure. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on it as someone who works in the industry, right, in academia, who's involved, who teaches and things. I think it would be remiss of me not to ask these questions. Though
Yeah.
I do want to return to kind of the point at hand, right? Now you mentioned looking at these things individually. You don't want to
Mhm.
rule on high on these things. You want to take into account each specific locality's rules, how they implement them, etc. Would you put that same lens, right? Would you use that same lens, why or why not, towards people who are implementing things like medical assistance in
Hmm.
death?
Um, hmm.
I
In a
guess what I'm asking you, right? To be a little more direct, right? It's obvious, like we've talked before, you've been on my show before, I've read your paper, right? You're pretty against suicide. You're against medical
Yes.
assistance. And you're just pretty much across the board against it. But I guess I ask you plainly, do you have any exceptions for this at all?
Personally, no. And then when the personal gets applied to policy, it gets more complicated, right? Because I have my ideal world and the policies that I would be willing to support. But I also think, and this is an argument I've had with lots of people in your server and elsewhere, when it comes down to assessing policies and their efficacy, right? I have my own view, which is I don't think this is a thing that should be ever endorsed by the government. But I can also look at other nations or states in the U.S. that have implemented forms of medical assistance in dying, euthanasia, etc., that have had, I would consider, slightly less bad consequences without the sort of like rapid escalation that you see in Canada that I think is worth criticizing. And so I want to believe that I can assess these things on sort of multiple levels. Like I could do a policy comparison between how things have gone in Canada and the rapid increase in percentage death attributed to MAID compared to fairly lax regimes in Europe that have allowed it for some time and been far more restrictive over the years, have not seen this explosion of people making use of it, and have been far more hesitant to open up accessibility because of all the concerns that people had about what happened in Canada. So I would say personally, no. In any policy in the U.S., like if it comes to like state by state in the U.S., and my state is considering kind of any form of euthanasia, medical assistance in dying, whether it's something like what Oregon has or something like what Canada has, I'm going to oppose it. But I think also we can sort of stack these policies against each other and say, well, one of these clearly is a slipperier slope than the other. And so I will fight much harder, obviously, against the ones that I think are just like going to have catastrophic consequences.
I
That makes
understand.
sense. Yeah.
Well, I guess I want to also ask, right, to kind of like again bring it a little back. What inspired you to write this particular topic? Of all the things that are going on in the world, we have tensions across Ukraine and Russia. We have China looking at Taiwan. We're looking at the Israel-Palestine stuff. We could look at poverty, all these other issues. Why write a paper on suicide?
Yeah, so this started quite a while ago. The funny thing about academic life is that projects sometimes take years longer than you would like them to. This project actually began fall of 2017. So I've been working on this almost 7 years now. And it started off as sort of a personal interest for both me and my co-author, who was my advisor in grad school. Both of us were interested in the concept or the problem of suicide for various, personal reasons that I won't go into for him, but also just, political reasons that we're looking at the headlines and we're seeing suicide rates spiking. We're seeing people talking about suicide contagion in the case of young people. This 2016, 2017, people were talking quite a lot about 13 Reasons Why, I believe it was somewhere around there. Or maybe it was in the midst of drafting this paper that the Netflix show was airing. But the book as well had some sort of controversy around it. And so we out of a range of topics, we looked at suicide and thought this is a very interesting topic that we would like to both personally sort of work through more. And then the project, as we understood it as political theorists, was, as I said, we do political theory for today, which often involves saying, well, okay, is there anything in the past that's useful for this concept, this idea? Is there anything that people have said before that would help us out as we have this conversation? And if you want to ask questions like that, I think the earliest place and the most common place to look is going to start with politics as it forms in ancient Greece. These are the people who thought very seriously, very early about politics and say, is there anything they can teach us? And sometimes you say, okay, some people have said some interesting stuff about what Plato said about XYZ topic, and you move on very fast. We found in our preliminary research that very few people had written about suicide, specifically in Plato's works. And as we began to dig into what he had to say, we found it very interesting. And so we thought, well, this seems like a good piece to grab onto, to say what was he on about this, and can it be useful at all for us today in a very different context, obviously very different moral presumptions that most of us have. Is there anything about the way that he understood the topic, talked about it, argued against it, that would be at least potentially able to be folded into the conversation we're having today? And things have gotten worse since we started the paper. So you say, there's a lot of other things going on, Palestine and all of this. That's true. But man, during the pandemic, the past couple of years, we had the highest recorded suicide rates on record since we started keeping track of stats like these. In the West, we had the worst years for suicide we have ever had in 2020, 2021, 22, and 3. We saw a slight dip back down, but it's bad. Things have gotten quite bad. And there was a recent report actually that the most recent stats that have come out have shown that there are certain demographics of young men, that is men from, I think it's 18 to 24, who now have higher suicide rates than middle-aged men, when our typical wisdom before has been that middle age and higher is where suicide becomes more of a problem as life, you hit midlife crises and things like this. So I would say it started out before all of these things you're talking about, and since then it's become even more salient, I think.
There's a lot there, and we'll kind of pick it apart one by one. I guess the first question, right? It does seem, from a layman's perspective, a strange place to turn for answers to the problems of today, right? Yeah. When we look at the potential causes, too. Like, I don't know. We've talked before, so spoiler alert and things. We look at social media. We look at the lockdowns. We look at just how we discourse one with another. Plato didn't have to deal with these problems. Plato didn't have... The concept of social media did not quite exist on the scale we see today, right? So how would we expect him to have any answers to this crisis? Now, we could talk about like in general, right? Like the idea of suicide. But if we're looking at the causes, if we're looking at why this epidemic, as you would say, is spreading, and then we want to tackle at the root, explain to me why Plato? Why?
Yeah, so I'd say you're right to think that like the reasons this is a pernicious problem today might be different than in the past, right? We are facing new political and technological situations that I think are sort of exacerbating this, what I would call a perennial human problem, right? People have always killed themselves for various reasons. And at least since people like Durkheim, we've understood that people kill themselves for different reasons, right? There are different types of suicides. There are suicides of despair, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I think you're right that we are in a very new situation in the grand historical scheme. But it is a perennial human problem in the sense that everyone has had to deal with some of the same anxieties that we have. Everybody, for all of human history, I think, has been having what we now term existential crises, crises of meaning, crises of faith, issues of depression, though it was not termed that then, issues of PTSD, though it was not termed that then, issues of felt loss of meaning or deep grief. All of these things are perennially human. And so this is one of the reasons I love teaching these old texts, is like when you see, for example, in the Iliad, Achilles grieving over Patroclus, like this is a human emotion that has not, it's, you know, the expression of it may have changed, the situation, circumstances may have changed, but we've all felt grief. And so though our temporal
Who hasn't
horizons
dragged their enemy around the city of Troy a few times,
exactly,
right? Like,
who has not mutilated their enemy's body? But like though our like world and our what Gadamer, who's one of my favorite thinkers on political theory, calls temporal horizons. Though our temporal horizons are different from Plato's, we can encounter his horizon and fuse ours with his, and we can sort of expand our minds in that way. And so what we were suggesting at the beginning of this paper is like, okay, there's a real problem today. And that problem is people are killing themselves. People are killing themselves at higher rates. And that rate has been increasing even as we've increased access to things like mental health, even as we've destigmatized treatment for mental health, even as we've learned more about what is actually effective in suicide prevention. So even as we've been doing better on the medical side, and I think that's unambiguously true, that we have been doing better on the medical side in many ways, suicide rates are increasing. And so the two options on the table, as far as I read it, are we are either the treatments themselves are not always as effective as we would like them to be, but I think there's good evidence that our treatments are fairly effective for at least a group of people. Or we just can't keep up with the problem, which is even more terrifying in some ways. And so that might suggest that we need sort of auxiliary units or additional resources to attack this problem, right?
Or to turn the or to like dam the stream, right? Like
right.
So,
whatever the causes are, or once you have whatever leads people to this act, stem one of those, right? Like stop people from feeling suicidal in the first place, or stop the people who feel suicidal from killing themselves. Those are our goals in the medical sense, and I would say in the political sense. And so we're just like, what other options are out there? How have people talked about this before that we might be missing? Yeah.
Well, hmm. I guess to start then, I'll ask, right? Since your paper primarily goes through the politics of it from a Greek perspective, right? It's from an ancient Greek perspective, specifically Plato's. What were some of the things that he had to say on the topic, and what to people who read your paper, what would you point them to if they were going to look at the meat of things, like the meat of Plato's either advocacy, or what has he said that will actually help in your opinion, I guess, to put it
Yeah.
simply.
I would say that first, Plato, I think, is ahead of the game a little bit. I think he is clued into a phenomenon of suicide that we've only recently really sort of started proving empirically. What we call suicide contagion. I think Plato was sensitive to and aware of. He's dealing with it through the lens of concepts that we don't always use anymore. These concepts in the title of Miasma and Katharmos, of pollution and purification. But I think he's doing it in ways that are at least analogous to or useful for the way we think about that. That's the first thing. The second is that he is dealing with suicide in a context where, Socrates, Plato's teacher and mentor, who figures prominently in almost all of Plato's dialogues, was himself a war veteran. He fought in the Peloponnesian Wars. He saved Alcibiades' life on the battlefield. And all these things are important for Socrates as both a historical figure and a character, and the ideas that he develops. Plato was not a veteran in that sense, but did go through some pretty traumatic events in his life, sold into slavery and a bunch of things, some great history about that coming out now. And so I think through the lens that Socrates offered Plato, and then that Plato made his own in many ways, we also get insight into a particular way of thinking about suicide that we say might be useful for a specific demographic, which is veterans, who have in many ways taught to think differently than the average person. Right. And you know this, you've been in the military, and I think anybody, like, you bring Connor on here, and anybody who's been in the military, right? There's something about the way that you're trained that is designed to make you different than you were in civilian life. You think you prioritize different things, you value different things, you think in terms of your unit or your platoon or your company or what have you, and that these things might be useful in tackling specifically the problem of veteran suicide. So something we say in the introduction is, there's a weird thing that happens actually in the history of suicide, and that's that there was a period of time where war veterans had lower suicide rates than the average population. And that is no longer the case. Veterans are one of the highest at-risk groups. Actually, I have to clarify this every time. Two of the highest at-risk groups are veterans and veterinarians, two very different types of vets. But so those are the two sides of it, I would say, is that one, Plato is clued into what I think we would call suicide contagion, thinking through these archaic terms, yes, but happy to explain that. And also that he's thinking in militaristic terms that might be useful as we try to address the veteran suicide problem.
I'm very curious about what, in your opinion, was the cause of the decrease in suicidality among veterans back in the period of time you allude to, where veterans generally were just not offing themselves at the same rate as everyone else, and much less lower rate. What was different between then and now? What is the difference between then and now when it comes to that specifically? I'm just curious. As a veteran, I kind of want to know this one.
Yeah. So this is all speculation. I won't put this on my co-author, and I won't suggest that I know this.
Fair.
But there's some really interesting research on the different mental outcomes of veterans of different wars. And one hypothesis that's been suggested, and I think is like supported by some evidence, but it's a historical counterfactual sort of thing. It's hard to prove. Is that one reason we see, for example, higher rates of PTSD among Vietnam veterans compared to World War II veterans is the way that the war was conducted, which is in World War II, you had large contingents of people shipping out together and coming back together. And that's why we get these like cool World War II stories of all these people who know each other. We can watch Band of Brothers or The Pacific, and you have characters that are constant through it. It's not fiction. That happened. These people served tours together and often stayed in longer than they needed to because they developed these relationships. And then they returned together. They had this period of shipping back that at least it's theorized, had a period of decompression that was mentally helpful for them. Compared to Vietnam, if you got conscripted, you were sort of brought in, you went through basic, yes, but you were sort of dropped in maybe somewhere where these people have been here for months, maybe years even. You don't know them, they don't know
Yeah,
you,
you
you're the
deploy
newbie.
individually. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you're pulled out individually. And so that's one theory, and I think so what we cite is that prior to 2008 the suicide rates were lower, and so I think the period of people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan seems to have they seem to have worse mental health outcomes than especially World War II veterans, but maybe even Vietnam veterans, although I don't know the research on that super well, so I don't want to say that super strongly. So I think one mechanism is like, how are you coming in? How is the war being conducted, and how are you coming back? Because well, and I can talk about this too. Something that we cite is there's this really interesting project called the Theater of War Project. It started out as a book discussing the idea that maybe veterans could work through some of their mental issues by encountering war stories, not just from their own culture, but from the ancient world. And so the Theater of War Project started putting on Greek tragedy for veterans and then holding discussion groups about that Greek tragedy. And it has had some very positive effects. You guys can look into this. Lots of big actors are associated with it now, Mark Ruffalo and some other people. And so we're sort of suggesting that, like, yeah, maybe whatever is going on there, that like processing that they're given by coming into this group, reading the text together and working through their collective trauma, even though they didn't serve together, perhaps, the experience of the play and then talking through it, maybe that is replicating some of this. That's sort of one of the theories, I suppose. Yeah.
Interesting. It's odd, right, to me, because one could argue that this was kind of like a just trying to shoehorn in something that doesn't really fit into a problem that's very modern. And I know you touched on this earlier, right? We have other much different scenario today than Plato did back and then. When we talk about two of the concepts you mentioned in the title of your work, Miasma and Katharmos, pollution, purification. What does that mean? When we talk about purification specifically, I think we can all kind of get what the pollution means, right? The contagion, right? The state of the world, capitalism, if you want to go that route, right? Like everyone can kind of grasp that. But when we talk about purification, what does Plato mean by that when he goes through this, and how does it relate to suicide?
Yeah. Okay, I do want to. I think it would be important actually to nuance the pollution part, because the term miasma gets picked up in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and if you just Google miasma or miasmatic thought, right, there's an early form of what would become like germ theory, basically, that sickness or disease is caused by literal bad air, miasma. Like when there's a line in Nietzsche where he says, "Oh, bad air," he says it's a miasma is what he's talking about. But before that, and before Plato even, there was a conception of miasma that your educated viewers might be familiar with through like Greek tragedy, right? That there are things that you do that impact the world and make it gross in a way that needs to be fixed. And so the classic example of this is Oedipus, right? So Oedipus doesn't intend to kill his father and marry his mother. In fact, he tries to avoid it. He runs away from the people he thinks are his father and mother, doesn't know that he's adopted, accidentally kills his father in a road rage incident, and then accidentally marries his mother after he solves the riddle of the Sphinx. But it doesn't matter that he didn't mean to do those things. He has done something metaphysically bad, right? Something about the world has been, something's been done bad about nature, and this sickness, this pollution creeps in. And it's really important for the ancients that this is different from like the wrath of the gods, right? It's not like you slept with your mom and so God is punishing you. It's like you've broken something about the natural order by doing this sexual act with somebody close to you, which I think is. It's also relevant for things like Jonathan Haidt's like moral foundations theory and things like this. But so this is the old way of thinking about it, is like even accidental things can bring about this pollution. What we found in our research on this topic is that Plato is actually kind of a turning point in history where he moralizes this concept in a way that was not common. And it's particularly relevant for suicide. So pre-Plato Greeks tended to attribute the blame to suicide, not to the person who killed themselves, but to the object that they killed themselves with. So if somebody hung themselves on a tree, for example, they would cut down and burn the tree. That was a way of purging what was left over from the suicide. If somebody fell on his sword and killed it, you might throw the sword into the sea. This was very common. But what we see in Plato's Laws, particularly later dialogue of his, quite long, is that there's a legal system in the Laws that is concerned with pollution and purification, but is very nuanced in the sense that your intent matters a lot in how much pollution happens. So if you accidentally killed someone, for example, in the Laws, well, okay, you go through a ritual purification, you are contrite, and whatever damage you've done to the community is kind of gone. And again, this is not like the wrath of God. It's not like I need forgiveness from God for this.
Yeah,
It's
you've
that
broken
if I killed if I
rule,
murdered
right.
somebody, that's gonna stick and it's gonna screw things up in my political community until it's punished. Right. But there are different levels of punishment for different intent. And this is, I think, something that transfers over well to our Western legal system, right? We have arguments about manslaughter versus second degree versus first degree murder. And because our intuition is some of these are worse than others.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyways, all that is to say, I think we complicate it in the sense that Plato moralizes pollution in a way that previous people didn't. And is it
So,
different from the
yeah,
miasmatic stuff?
it is a kind of like a natural. We talk about consequences a lot, right? And this has been on my mind for a while, right? Like when people like, oh, we don't want accountability culture. It's consequent culture, accountability culture. These words, right? Holding someone accountable, the consequences of your actions and things like that. The difference between a natural consequence of your actions and an artificial consequence of your actions, right?
Mm-hmm.
A natural consequence has many parallels to what you talk about, like when you've done something that violates the natural order, and therefore it has this kind of curse effect upon you until it is rectified, that these things will just come naturally because you've done this thing. Whereas an artificial consequence would be like the wrath of God, right? Would be like someone coming in and hoisting and holding you to account, and making a judgment upon you. I'm curious when it comes to the subject at hand for today. Do you moralize? Is it good that we've moralized suicide? Some people would say no. Some people would
Yeah.
say, hey, right, this is just a consequence of just the world, right? If you are sick and dying, no one's really at fault here. You have this disease. You've done nothing to earn this disease. Why not provide someone a way out? Why are you moralizing this? Why
Yeah.
isn't this simply a tool? What's moral about having an old man who is suffering on the verge of death and telling him he doesn't have the ability to take take the exit in the way that he wishes?
Yeah. Let me start with like what Plato says, and then I'll see if I can adapt it to what I say. What Plato is grappling with in the Laws, or again, these are dialogues, so he has characters. So there's this character, the Athenian stranger, who's proposing a legal system. What Plato is grappling with in the Laws is a system of moralized pollution, that things are worse due to greater intent and also greater closeness of relationship that is betrayed. So, for example, he thinks that murdering your brother or your father is worse than murdering a random stranger in a bar fight, right? And I think as much as we might try to rationalize that away, that's an intuition that many of us have, right? The kind of person like when we see headlines about
Betrayal comes into the mix,
yes,
right?
yes. When we see headlines about these men who are what we call now like family annihilators, right? The idea that someone could kill his wife and his children is just like abhorrent to us on a level that is like different from just random mugging, stabbing, right? It's like, wow, what a bad person, versus just like I just physically can't even imagine how someone does that. And so what he's grappling with in the system of punishment that he sets up in the Laws, which is to try to purify this pollution that comes in when bad things happen. The point of the purification, which you asked about before, by the way, is just to preserve the bonds that tie the community together, right? The pollution is kind of the sticky stuff that gets in the cracks. Like somebody breaks open this part of the community and the pollution gets in there and starts like wedging it apart. And the goal is to keep things tight and bonded and cohesive. And we have to clear that pollution. And so it's different depending on the type of murder. And so that might strike us as unjust, but yeah, you get punished worse if you if, for example, in the Laws, if you accidentally kill a slave, you go through ritual purification. If you kill your mother, you get the death penalty. There's no flexibility here. But then the question is, well, what if someone kills the person who is nearest and dearest to them? I mean themselves, right? That's like the almost the worst conceivable closeness of relationship, right? I'm close to my mother because she raised me. I'm close to my siblings because we were raised together. But me, I'm with myself all the time. It's the closest relationship I have. So what do we do when that happens? Is the question on the table, and the punishment in the laws is a kind of anonymization. The memory of the suicide is put out, and so.
When you
It's
say put
moralized.
out, can you be more specific? Like, are
Yeah,
you talking
so
about their names get erased from the records and no one talks about them anymore? Does their name become taboo? Do they just not speak about them for a while, or
they
what
they don't
happens?
speak about the act of suicide, and their grave is not memorialized. So they're supposed to be buried on the edges of the city in an unmarked tomb, which is if you've read Antigone, this is shocking to Greek culture that you would
Well,
not give proper
this has
funerary rites to people
a
there.
lot of parallels between people who would say that we should stop when we cover mass shooters, for example.
Hmm.
We kind of or serial killers
Yes.
in a lot of ways. We aggrandize them, like even the fact that we're paying attention to them, the currency of attention, the coin of attention, which is a coin of today in many different ways, gets paid to these people, and it is kind of like a intentional or not, it's a homage
Hmm.
that we give. So this idea of simply shunning a suicide, right?
Yeah.
Of shaming, if we want to use that word,
Hmm.
of suicide, does
Yeah.
have, I guess, applications today. Is that something you would advocate for?
So I would say I would want to analogize it. Okay, so I wouldn't want to advocate for what Plato gives us, which I think you're right is closer to just like eliminating their name from the record, right? As opposed to, I think the healthier version of this is recognizing, yes, there is a sort of contagion effect when we magnify the names of people who go out shooting, or when we magnify the names and methods of suicides, especially of celebrities in our headlines. We just know now that it's the case that when we publicize suicides, particularly the method of suicide, and particularly if the person who kills themselves is famous, that this pushes people sort of over the brink. And so this is something we don't deal with super extensively because neither of us are medical professionals, but we did our best to sort of like dive into the suicide prevention literature to at least get like mildly competent on it. And if anybody watching now is a professional who wants to say we're wrong about anything, I'm happy to take correction. But one of the things you'll see in the suicide prevention literature is that there's a lot of like intellectual hurdles that people have to go over to actually attempt to end their own lives. I'll be interested to see people compare that to the kind of mental process people go through with maids. But um, and one of those at least is sort of even conceiving of it as an option, you know, when you start planning. This is like why it's a screening question if you get a mental health evaluation, is have you thought of ways you're going to do it. But another is not just thinking of how you would do it, but thinking of yourself doing it is a barrier that a lot of people have trouble with. And something that seems to psychologically help people overcome that barrier is if they see somebody they consider a mentor or an exemplar do it themselves. And so, for example, there's a study that we cite, and I don't want to lean too heavily on this. I don't know if it's been replicated. I don't know how rigorous it is, but it's interesting at least. There's a study that we cite that in the months following Robin Williams' death, they publicized that he killed himself, not just that he died, and the method, and that there was a statistically significant, which okay, I'm not going to statistical significance. Just Google the term. It doesn't mean a lot. It just means we've shown everything that we
Enough to
can,
think to
enough to
make
think
it,
it's
yeah,
causal.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So there's a statistically significant spike in suicides of particularly middle-aged men around his age to later, because he was like 60. So like 40 to 60-year-old men killing themselves specifically with the method he used. Right. So there seems to have been something about the publicization of not just that he killed himself, but the way he did it that helped people overcome one of those mental hurdles. And so this is what we're suggesting that Plato was like kind of keyed into before we had empirical evidence for it. That there's something about dwelling on these things that leads more people to view it as a real live option in a way that we would want to discourage. And so, for example, there was a rash of things, I think it was 70s or 80s, there was a rash of subway jumpers in New York. And the New York Times decided to stop putting in the headlines that people were jumping on subways. And after that, there was a decrease in people doing this. We think that's a perfectly reasonable policy for at least a news publication to take in terms of like governmental policies, it might be a bit more nuanced in terms of free speech and things. But yeah, like we would probably prefer more places to
Sure,
be
I would.
responsible in reporting those things. Yeah.
I'm certain you wouldn't advocate that it be against the law to do this.
Yeah.
But if you were like an editor at a magazine, or if you were on someone who was thinking out tweeting the latest scandals or whatever,
Mhm.
right? Eh, Tweeting about suicide, right, and tweeting specifically the method that they used. Um, yeah, it could, if this is true, if the data is accurate, um, you would advocate for them, people who are in this position, just to not do it, to just not talk about it at all. Like, so
Um,
if someone has a family member that kills themselves, what are they supposed to do? If not talk about it, how are they supposed to handle it?
yeah. I think there's I would want to say layers of nuance, I suppose. But my favorite answer for everything is it depends. Um, so I think, for example, that the intuition that a lot of people have, like when a family member dies, for example, to not make their death specifically about their suicide is a good one. Now, I also understand that there are people who will use that opportunity to like raise awareness or what have you, right? There are people who will say we intentionally want to have no shame about this, and say like this is what happened, and so we hope you will seek help. And I think both of those to me seem like viable options. The difference between what I think Plato is advocating and the sort of like how we deal with it on an individual level is that me, for example, being willing to say, "Oh, my XYZ family member died, and you may have noticed they died young. Yes, they killed themselves, and here's a resource if you need it," is quite different, I think, from what we are sort of critical of, which is not destigmatization of pursuit of help for suicidal ideation, but destigmatization of suicide itself. And again, somebody, if anybody in your chat is a professional and wants to slap me on this, that's fine. But as far as we've read the literature, this is a very fine line to walk, right? That the suicide prevention literature seems to say that shame is not an effective tool in the same way that in like obesity studies, shame is not a terribly effective tool. But as far as we've been able to ascertain, what this means is when someone is experiencing thoughts of suicide or feelings like they can understand why someone wouldn't want to be alive anymore, that's not something that you shame someone for, right? People feel that way. We can understand why that happens, and you need help for that, etc. That's the kind of thing you should encourage someone to lean on their community for, not shame them for. But the actual act of suicide itself, inculcating a society, for example, that says suicide is a thing you should not do, is not something that, as far as we're aware of, leads more people to kill themselves, right? It's how we handle people who themselves are like, man,
Does
I'm
the
really struggling.
opposite?
That matters. Right?
Does the
Sorry.
opposite? So if a society, say, let's use a fictional country, right? Like Canuckia, okay? So
Hmm.
there's a
Hmm.
fictional country called Canuckia, and not only did they not stigmatize suicide or assisted death or whatever they wanted to call it, but instead made programs to help you do it, right? To help you engage in this. Do you think that would lead to an increased rate of this happening?
I would assume yes. I would call this a kind of normalization, and so I think this is something that like we the reason we want to grab onto this like sort of pre-modern approach is not so we can just thump people over the head with like some ancient Greek theology of like you belong to God and so you shouldn't kill yourself, that kind of thing, which is an argument that Plato advances, or that Socrates advances in Plato's works. It's that what we would prefer is a political community where both fewer people feel like they want to end their lives, and one that has a sort of positive rather than the negative approach to this issue. Where and people will be very critical of this, but my perspective on the euthanasia stuff the entire time has been when you create a policy that says XYZ people qualify for the government to assist them in dying, what you are effectively doing, you can nuance this and maybe do a better job of it than Canada has. But what you are effectively doing is creating a list of lives that are at least potentially not worth living. And so you've created a list of people who, when they experience those circumstances, now have that thought put into their heads. And so again, like with again the little bit I'm familiar with the suicide prevention literature, the idea that like, well, maybe my life just isn't worth living is something you want to avoid putting in people's heads. You want to do everything you can to make them understand positively why their life is worth living, rather than I think giving them a sort of government endorsed list of conditions that they meet that now mean their life may qualify for not the kind of life we want our citizens to live. Yeah.
There's a
So yeah, I don't want to be like too strong in the sense that like, again, there are
do it,
regimes out
Howard.
there.
Go ahead.
No, there are regimes out there that have had a form of euthanasia for much longer and seem not to have gone down the slippery slope, and I think that's better than the alternative. But I do think there's something weird about how things have been happening in Canada that like the reporting recently, even among advocates, right? There are advocates now who are like, members of nonprofits that have been pushing for this policy who are saying, yeah, we saw this as a sort of in extremis kind of thing. Like when you have something so bad, you can't imagine living life anymore. This is an option available to you, where now it's in many cases or in many cases that fit the definitions within the brackets they've established, viewed as like a normal option rather than a last chance option. And that I think they're clued into something real there. Yeah.
One of the frustrating parts of talking to you is you do love the nuance, right? You swim in it, and I think you use it a little bit as a chaff, right? To distract, to kind of obfuscate, to hide, to muddy the waters just a bit. I will be a little more brave than you are and say that we as a society want to put up more obstacles to people who want to off themselves and not less. And every time you remove obstacles and put pavement on the road down that path, when you make it easier to travel, easier to do, you are, yes, partly responsible for the people who are going to end their lives because of that, right? And I think that this happens a lot. None of us are free from sin in this, right? None of us. We've all done this to some extent, where we've lessened the value of the lives around us, whether it be intentional or not. I think that when it comes to government policies especially, there are incentives at play that make it much more insidious than just a rando on Twitter telling you to kill yourself or that you don't matter, right? There's a difference of scale, there's a difference of efficacy, and there's a difference when it comes to how society views it, how culturally we look at these things.
Yeah, there's very good
Go ahead.
there's a very good Vonnegut short story about this that I think, I've never seen definitive evidence of this, but I think is the inspiration for the suicide booths in Futurama. It's called To Be or Not to Be, but it's spelled out like 2B02B. And the story is effectively one of population control, that you have a world where somebody has to die for someone else to be born, and someone figures out that a relative is having twins, and et cetera, et cetera. But I think it captures both the conflict that people feel about the issue of government endorsed suicide and the disastrous consequences of that in very effective literary ways. I don't want to suggest, of course, that Canada is at the point of literal suicide booths. I don't think that's accurate. I do think that with the data that we've seen since 2016 is when they sort of officially allowed some of these things, and then the expansions they've set up since then, and then they've sort of indefinitely postponed the mental health expansion. I think we've seen like something is deeply wrong with either their political community or the medical system, or both, such that like this option has been opened, and now a bunch of people qualify for it who are dying who would not have died otherwise. And I think I agree with everything. I'm not trying to be like too cagey. I think you're right. Like I want more friction on the path to ending your own life, because that seems obvious to me that that's what we want in a political community.
Well, let's talk about that. First of all, $5 from Origin of Logos to say, pretty sure Philip is being thoughtful rather than being WhickTV. Well, fair enough, right? But we can think
It
our
could be
way.
Weasley too. It could
We
be
can
both.
think our way in circles, okay? And someone has
Yeah.
to break. Like, there's a reason, like when someone says "snap out of it" and they slap you, it's to stop the little thought trap that the little oubliettes that you've kind of captured yourself in. Analysis paralysis is a real thing, and sometimes we gotta snap out of it. But that said, I too don't think I like Ukerist. I think it's great. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the idea of bodily autonomy and the quote unquote right to die. So the argument, as I understand it, and I'll steelman it the best I can, is that if you don't own your own life, right? If you are not able to do with your life as you will, then how can we ever be free as people? And that is the first and most fundamental freedom that every man, woman, and child on this earth has, is the ability, right, to choose how they live and, as it follows, if they live. And if someone simply does not want to be here anymore, who are we? Who are you or I to come in and tell them that's not okay? Like, we don't own them. We're not their masters. We have no, like, what is it to you or I that some stranger that we have no connection to chooses how they end their life, or whether they end their life? What does that matter? And is it not a tyranny of the system? Is it not a tyranny for the government to think of the absurdity? You're trying to kill yourself and they arrest you for it because it's illegal? What is going on?
Yeah, so on the like what's it to you question, I think this is another area where Plato is very helpful. And again, not everybody thinks in these terms, because the ancient Greek view of the political community is very different from our modern liberal democratic one. But the language that's used in the Fedo, so just to set things up, if anybody's listening who has not read it, the Fedo is the dialogue that takes place right before Socrates drinks the
Imagine
hemlock.
not reading the Fedo, but go on.
I know, right?
Crazy.
So, you may have read the apology of Socrates, his defense trial, but then after that, there's the 𝕾𝖍 where he's in prison and his friend's trying to convince him to escape. And then the Fedo comes where he's about to drink the poison and die. He's been waiting on a ship to return from the island of Delos.
Is that not suicide, right?
Well, okay, footnote on this conversation. In the laws, the Athenian stranger says there are certain cop-outs we would want to give for somebody for this punishment for suicide. And this is, I think, the best case of rescuing that law and having it be a sort of like one that respects our modern sensibilities, in which these caveats are actually pretty expansive. He basically says, okay, a suicide is where you take your life unjustly without being ordered to by your political community, which includes, rushing into battle or being condemned to death. Without some sort of, great grief or tragedy that befell you, etc. He gives it like a bunch of caveats that give, I think, compassionate people a kind of out to say, okay, well, that thing that happened is not the kind of suicide that we want to condemn. But the way we're interpreting this is the injunction is don't kill yourself. And then the compassionate part of the law is, okay, but if you do it for these reasons, we can understand, and we're not going to bury you anonymously and purge your name for the records, right? So that's so one explicit caveat that he gives is it's not technically a legal suicide if you are following a command of your political community to do something like drink hemlock and kill yourself. Yeah. This has been debated, by the way, since Xenophon, which is another one of Socrates.
Sure,
students.
it's
the
just
question of did Socrates kill himself or was he forced to? Yeah,
he killed himself because he was okay. Look, I don't know why you're debating this. Very simple answer: yes, he killed himself because he was ordered to. If he had any guts, he would have made the state do it. Like, yeah, no, I'm not going to kill myself. You have to do it, right?
But you got to read the 𝕾𝖍 for why he's willing to follow the Athenian law in this case.
Everyone's everyone's got their reasons, right? But go ahead.
Okay, so right before that, his students start crying right when he's about to drink the hemlock. That's the occasion for this whole dialogue, and he says, "Why are you crying? Have you not been paying attention? I've been teaching this whole time that philosophy is practice for death. Like you are preparing to do what your soul will do in eternity, which is like whatever disembodied souls do." Basically, he thinks philosophy is elevating yourself above your material condition to think about whatever is eternal. And so whatever happens to your soul after death, he says, is kind of indifferent because it will be, separate from the material, which I've been teaching you to do through philosophy. And one of his students kind of like raises his hand, is like, does that mean we should all just kill ourselves? And he's like, no, wait a second, hold on. And has to like present this argument against suicide. And so his first argument is theological. He says that, well, you are the property of the gods, and so they'd be mad if you killed yourself, so don't do that. But the other arguments that he uses have slightly different language. One of them is one of purification, that, well, philosophy is practice of purifying your soul. You're ready for death when your soul is purified, but you can't really ever know when it's fully purified. So just keep on doing it until you keel over, and then you'll be in the best shape. But other language that he uses in that part is sort of militaristic, like I said before, that like you don't abandon your post. And there's color in the background of this culturally of Greek city-states fought in the form of the phalanx, which you've seen only briefly in the 300 movie, right? They only have a phalanx for like 5 seconds, and then they all devolve into normal random fighting. But that's not how they actually fought, right? They had a shield wall in the front that your shield protected half of your body and half of the person next to you. And so one of the reasons cowardice is so heavily punished in these ancient Greek societies is your cowardice of dropping your shield and running away doesn't just, ruin the battle. It doesn't just like fail to meet some political goal. It puts the person next to you in mortal danger. If you drop your shield and run away, they're at risk. And this is the language that he uses to suggest that suicide is bad. So you say, what's it to you? Well, he's trying to get you to think in terms of this, like maybe a militaristic concept of citizenship, that we are all each dependent on each other in this political community. And when one person falls out of line, that affects everyone else. And we feel this obviously most intimately when we have close networks of friends and family when someone kills themselves. But sometimes it doesn't happen, right? Sometimes somebody is a sort of a loner or despondent or experiencing, terrible strife, and like their exit from the community doesn't clearly affect everyone else. Plato is pulling in this pollution concept to say, no, it does actually affect everyone else. When you normalize that kind of thing, it gets that sticky stuff in the cracks and kind of pulls it all apart. And so, yeah, I think that's the ground I would want to argue on, is like, not only does it hurt the people closest to you, but it has long-term knockdown effects on the whole political community.
What kind of I want to tie this into the now, if I may. And I know your paper focuses mostly on Plato, and that's fun. But I do want to kind of talk about the now, because we talk about personal responsibility, and we talk a lot about responsibility in general. But there is this school of thought, right? There is this idea that you don't owe your community anything. And what I mean by that, because it sounds selfish, but there is some bite to it, right? If your community doesn't serve you, right? If they haven't, like, if they are part of the reason, if they have failed you, right? Are you the one dropping your shield, or have they left you at mortal peril, right? Have they left you at mortal peril, and rather than sit there and suffer, you simply choose to exit? So I guess I would turn the question that I originally asked you, what is it to you, on its head. And thank you for the bits, by the way, from 𝕵𝖎𝖙. 300 bits for I could still use some soul cleansing, but I just had a colonic. Thank you for the bits. I guess I would turn the question around and say, what is it to them that they hurt their community? So
I think the my biggest takeaway from this paper, I don't know if this is my co-author's biggest takeaway, I don't know if it's anybody else's who reads this paper, but my biggest takeaway is that the sort of way Plato is asking us to think about suicide is a both and proposition. Yes, there's the individual side, which is like, we don't want you to kill yourself, and maybe here's some reasons why you shouldn't. If you believe in God, here's some reasons. If you believe in these political values, here's some reasons, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also a sort of condemnation on the community itself where this becomes a problem. And so there's this really great paper that we cite by Lorraine Pangel. She's a really great, maybe about to retire scholar. She's pretty old at this point. Scholar at UT Austin of Plato and the ancients. And she talks about the laws where we're pulling out this pollution stuff. And she says one of the things that she takes out of the laws is that the system of pollution and purification seems intended to suggest that a political community that suffers from some of these problems is the reason those problems are happening. Like, the community as a whole bears a responsibility. It's not the agent or the individual who did the bad thing. It's like, what sort of community did you create where this is an option or a problem? And this is something that gets picked up by one of my favorite philosophers, who I reference every chance I get, 𝕬𝖓 MacIntyre, in a book called Dependent Rational Animals. And the title is kind of playing off of, Aristotle says that human beings are rational animals. And to an extent, what it means to be rational for Aristotle is to be independent. If you live a contemplative life, as long as you've got all the physical stuff that you need, you can do that in your own head, right? You don't have to, unlike a political person who has to go out in the world and negotiate with people and deal with budgets and stuff, you get to be contemplative in your own brain. But what McIntyre is highlighting in dependent rational animals is that whole system, in the background, has a whole network of people who are severely dependent: the young, the old, the sick, the disabled. And so he thinks that basically what you get if you sort of adopt the ancient view of the polis, or the political community, is a system of saying the measure of a good political community is how well off are your young, your sick, your old, and your disabled. How well off are the people with PTSD? Like, are these people suffering? Are they taken care of? Right? I mean, there's this meme that goes around every now and then that's like, oh, people asked all these smart people like when civilization started in human history, and this one anthropologist said it's when we discovered a healed femur, because they took care of this person until their leg healed. And I don't know if that's actually true, if that person ever said that or not, but that meme is actually, I think, captures something really essential, which is like a good political community is the one that says, well, oh, you just broke your leg, we're not going to leave you behind. We take care of you, and we support you, and we create the conditions in which the people who are healthy and well off can go do their independent reasoning and philosophy stuff. Ooh, have fun with that. But really what matters is this sort of underlying bedrock of like, we're taking care of what I would call in a Christian context the least of these, right?
That makes sense. Do you think that the culture we're creating now, right? Um, you cited the spike in the 2020s, right, of suicide. Do you think that this is evidence that we have been failing in our duties as a community, right? That we have failed our people, so to speak? And in what ways would you consider us failing them? Oh, you muted yourself, buddy.
Right. Oh, there we go. Sorry. I would say I think so. I think we have some significant failings, and so so we're honing in on the veteran community here. I think a lot of veterans have experience, depending on where you're at, of the VA being a terrible bureaucratic enterprise. And so, even if you have legitimate concerns, physical or mental, that those are very difficult to get addressed in a timely fashion. I think that's like obviously something that um, that should be dealt with, on a policy level. Like, these are the people most who should be taken care of. They've sacrificed something, or even if you are critical of the sorts of wars that America has been involved in recently, right? These are the people who were called up or who heeded a call and were told, this is what you should do, this is your duty, and they followed it and they suffered consequences. And so those, I feel like, are the people that we owe the most to, and at times we're doing the least for. And so that's one area I would say we're dramatically failing. The other thing is, and we cite this as well, the CDC, kind of suicide prevention pamphlet says that like one of the most significant impacts you can have on someone's suicidality is just having a way to make them feel like they belong in a community. And we just really suck at this now. I mean, we've been talking about atomism and individualism and alienation and these things, again, since at least like Durkheim and Marx and all these people, right? So it's been around for a long time. It's not terribly new. But we may actually be worse at dealing with it now, in some ways. Like, you have Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone that says all these associations we used to have in our communities are sort of rotting. People are not investing in them anymore. For various reasons. Sorry, I should not keep chat open when I do these things. But Testicle Johnson did say guns ? And actually, yes, that's a real answer. If you want another answer of how we actually address this problem, is I taught a class many years ago called Guns in Society, and a third of that class was just analysis of the empirical literature on gun control and how effective it is. And it turns out a lot of gun control measures are sort of like shrug emoji effective in America, because America has such a patchwork of laws that it's hard to isolate what's caused by one particular state's laws versus I can drive to the next state, get a gun, and come back, that kind of thing. But the laws that we know are wildly effective are waiting periods for handguns and safe storage laws. That if you one of the reasons men have a higher suicide rate than women is because they tend to use deadlier methods. Instead of pills, they use guns. And so if someone is feeling immediately suicidal, if you allow them to immediately access a firearm, that's bad. And so 2 ways you can diminish their immediate access to firearms are a short waiting period or a locked safe. And both of those seem to actually effectively reduce suicide rates. So yes, if you're just talking about like actual policies we can enact tomorrow that would reduce these things, that yes, 100%. Tesco Johnson, yes.
No, it makes sense. I I am curious on to kind of like if it's hard to kind of pin down a single source for kind of the malaise that has come across us and is leading. Now we can point to the lockdowns, for example, in the 2020s, and that might be a correlation between the increased suicides because we were more isolated and things like that. But I look more and more and more into how we discourse with each other, not just on a national stage, but even in these communities. And I know you said atomization is kind of a meme, but I wanted to kind of focus in on that for just a moment. We have kind of done this thing where we've refused to talk to each other. When we talk about purification, one of the things we've ironically done is tried to purify our communities, purify who's around us, cast out those bad actors and things like that. Do you think that this is actually having a measurable impact here, or do you think that this is kind of like just trying to kind of shoehorn in a problem, shoehorn in a hobby horse that I have just to look at the problem? What are your thoughts on this? Go ahead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My intuition is yes, because I share your complaint with these sorts of, you know,
Yeah,
purity
but
tests
intuition is
and what
one
have you.
thing, and I'm just curious, you
Um,
know what I mean?
I don't, I'm not aware of any specific evidence that involvement in niche online communities, for example, increases your risk of suicide. I think for a long time we've been very hopeful that those sorts of things will alleviate people's risk. Right? We've been optimistic about the idea that I could find an online community that fits my niche of the world, and these will be people who support me. And so I'm not aware of any like particular evidence that like pushes me one way or another on that. I would just say in general, I think the evidence is fairly clear that being more online ends up being bad for us. I don't think that requires being part of one of these like super niche, extreme purity testing communities. I think it's true of our parents and our grandparents just as much. Like that being online as a boomer versus being online as a 12-year-old, it's gonna suck. And seems to have, I think, particularly pernicious impacts on the mental health of young women. But I'm still working through Jonathan Haidt's new book, Anxiety Generation. I'm still working through it and seeing if the underlying evidence supports his thesis that it's just the phone's stupid. But so yeah, my intuition is you're right that as we segment into these siloed purity tested communities, things will probably be worse for us in some ways because like I think a healthy political community is one that involves a certain amount of diversity and intercourse between different people, intercourse in the intellectual sense, of course, and all the other senses. But I don't want to like lean too hard into that because I don't know for sure if that's true, and that's one of those things that comes back to bite you, right? We make a lot of predictions that are bad. Like it turns. So one of
Sure.
sorry. Side note, really quick. On actually no, it's not a side note. It's exactly on this, which is we had a fear for a long time that internet algorithms and filtering and selecting for communities would lead to actual like thick bubbles. Like we had this idea that we would filter out all the people who disagree with us, and it turns out like yes, a lot of us spend time in communities that agree with us, but that sort of like filter effect has not borne out the way we thought it might, in the sense that most of us really like yelling at people, right? I just had an argument a couple nights ago in Erudite's Discord server, and now we're going to have a debate about it. Like, it's really fun for me to yell at people who disagree with me. So while I am part of communities that are more niche, that I know these people and I know they share much more beliefs with me, it's also fun for me to see things on my timeline that I hate and that I can retweet and be angry about.
Well,
Right? So these filter effects have not borne out the way we
that
thought they
doesn't hold
might
on.
exactly.
So I don't think that I don't think that contradicts this fear that you cited at the beginning, where we feared for a while that they would create thick bubbles. I think it just reinforces the bubble. Dunking, right? We're not
Mhm.
having conversations.
Oh, sure,
We're
sure.
dunking. We're taking it. We love to hate. Nothing
Yeah.
will bind a community stronger. Nothing will bind a community stronger than shared hatred.
So
Shared
I would
hatred
say
of the enemy. And so
the
if I
difference
may
between this. Oh, no, sorry, sorry.
if I may finish though, just briefly, right? And so when we talk about like people love to yell, yes, that's true, and they will interact with other communities, but not in the same way or in what I would call a healthy way.
Yes.
And I think that this is only exacerbating the problem of bubbles rather than alleviating it. Bubbles, bubbles, bubbles. If we say it enough time, Brittany Simon
Yeah.
will come. But anyway, go
Oh
ahead.
boy. No, no. Exactly. I think you summarized exactly what I was going to clarify, which is, I think the fear initially with the filter effect was like, I'm only going to see the things I agree with, and I will get everything reinforced in my beliefs. The fear now, I think, with what's like what you're calling these bubbles is, I know which people are in my sphere and not, and I react to them accordingly. And so if you are outside of my sphere, I give you this outrage reaction. If you're inside my sphere, I give you the positive reaction. But yeah, so I think you're, yes, exactly what you explained, I think is true. It was just that for a while we had this like real fear that like we would completely silo ourselves to where we were never exposed to alternative things. Now I think the fear is we are exposed to alternative things, and we immediately slot them in the other category. And these are people that I'm gonna trash on Twitter.
They're the enemy,
When I
right?
quote tweet somebody, man, I want them to respond. I want them to quote tweet me back, and
Yeah.
I want to go back and forth. Yeah, but so I see lots of stuff on my timeline that drives that outrage, and so it's not the strong filter effect that we thought before. It's like, yeah, it's the tribal effect more.
And I think, like, in a way, right? And again, this is just my intuition. I want to be clear. I don't have data on this. This is my intuition, right? This is my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that this is also a driving factor in increased self-harm rates. Not just self-suicide rates, but increased rates in self-harm across the board. It's this idea of losing the war of hopelessness, right? When you see the other teams as strictly your enemy, every success they have feels like a failure on your part. Now, yes, we aren't siloed in that we never interact, but we are in this space where we are so driven to see not just our side succeed, but the other side fail. And this works both so it both works on the target and the person that is doing the firing. So the target of everyone's ire, that everyone wants to see fail. Your enemies are constantly coming at you. Your enemies are constantly picking at you, and you there are enemies everywhere at all times. You can't get away from it in many ways. This is obviously, I think, again, no data, just using hypothesis here. Obviously, this is increasing people's rates of self-harm and suicide. Obviously. It also has the opposite effect. When you are constantly haranguing, barraging, attacking your quote-unquote enemy, but you see no change, you can feel hopeless. This battle's never going to be won. I keep trying and trying and trying. My seed keeps trying and trying and trying, right? But Palestine will never be free, so I might as well light myself on fire, right? And so we got this weird kind of like, even people's suicides are used as a political pawn now, right? They're used as a political toy. And everything has just become so weaponized, for lack of a better term.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think online conversation we saw around the well, there have been two recent self-immolations, but the earlier one, regarding the Palestine stuff, I think I would be
Do you think
concerned
that's
with, yeah.
miasma?
I think it's potentially miasmatic. Yeah, when we hold this person up as a hero, when we make posters about him, when we say like this is a person who did a heroic thing, I find that quite bad. And people were like, oh, what about I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the Vietnamese name, the monk who self-immolated. I would say the exact same thing. I mean, again, like this was an orchestrated political stunt where he killed himself by burning. We got some very famous pictures out of it. I think it's very it's worth thinking about why he did that. But it's not something I would ever want to glorify or lionize. No, yeah.
Oh, do you think that that's what happened?
I saw some people doing it, but again,
Overall, I'm
because
talking like as a
oh
society,
no,
as a
I think most
culture.
people were to the extent that they understood what this guy did and why, I think were sort of shocked and outraged by it. Um, maybe. Oh well, okay. The second guy was just seems like an unwell conspiracy theorist. From the things that I've read, the first guy seemed to have done it in a very kind of considered political fashion, more like the Vietnamese example. And I did see some people, I think what Hassan was very cagey about it, but some fairly prominent people being not condemnatory of it, right? I would say I would want to be supremely cautious of anything that even approaches that line that says
What
like,
a
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, what would you consider the people? Because we saw the people who praised it. Let's talk about the people who mocked it. Do you think that's helpful, or do you think that's
Um,
just kind of in bad taste? What are your thoughts on that side of it?
mhm.
I'm just curious. Is that also miasma?
No, I think it, I think it, I need to think about that. I would condemn that as well. I wouldn't mock someone who did that. I would again, like on the like McIntyre point. I would want to wonder like what sort of political community creates a person who thinks this is his best or only option for getting his message out there, for helping cause. I feel bad for someone who feels like that's the thing to do, and so I wouldn't want to mock him either. So yeah, I'd need to think about that. Like I think the yeah tentative. I think the mocking thing might even trivialize it in a way that I find very problematic. Like I think we should treat someone ending their own life in any circumstance, whether that's made or whether it's self-immolation or anything in between, as a very serious thing that ought to be grappled with and understood as seriously as it is. Yeah.
Interesting. Because a lot of the people I saw mocking it, not a lot, I should say, a few, right, when questioned on it or when confronted on it, would say things like, well, I'm simply trying to stigmatize this more. And
Mhm.
so letting you know that instead of being a hero, you're going to be a laughing stock. Instead of being a on the news and like having your message heard, your message will be drowned out by the sounds of laughter.
Mm.
And so, and it has made me wonder, right, of the utility based things. And I want to talk a little bit, I guess, and use this as a jumping off point to talk about utility in suicide.
Mhm.
Um, there are use cases, right, that some people have put forth for suicide as a way to garner attention, being the one we just talked about, but also as a way to end, like, to take care of a problem that medicine can't take care of.
Yeah.
So I know we've talked about this in private, but I just want to talk about it in public. Like, so for me, I'm very anti-maids, very anti-maids.
Mhm.
However, I do think that there are some caveats and exceptions where I would still not advocate for it, but I would want a process there. One of those being someone who has a very short time left in life. And we know that they have a very short time left in life. 6 months. We know what will happen. We know the pain that will go. We know there's no chance, realistic, of any kind of succor or release. Do you not think that there should be any process in place to maybe help people who don't have access to firearms or gun or medicine or things so that they could actually get help to do this? What would be wrong with that?
Okay. Let me collect my thoughts on that while I spew something that's already in my brain very quickly, which is on the mocking thing. I think that we have precedent for this kind of thing where it's rare, but I want to say it's in Britain, and it's like a sort of like Victorian or earlier era law. There are places where the laws against suicide have included post-death punishment for suicide, like flogging in the streets of a body of someone who killed themselves. And those are rare, but they exist. Because the intuition is well, this is something we want to publicly discourage, right? And I think those are rare, and I think those ought to be discouraged in the sense that I think they accomplish the same thing as like headlines about suicide, which is to like you are the emphasis on it or the mocking or the derision of it is not the
Any
point,
attention,
right?
it's like any attention
Yeah,
is kind of like attention we don't want, whether it be positive or negative. Is that the
I think so. Yes, I think that's and again, I think this is what like Plato was clued into in a way with the like, well, just bury them subtly on the edges of the city. So yeah, I understand why you would want to disincentivize by saying you will be made a mockery of, but I'm not entirely sure that that functions the way we want it to. Okay, on the should we have some sort of pathway and why I have this sort of like absolutist view of this. I understand the intuition, and this is like every argument I've ever had about this. Someone will accuse me of being heartless or not caring about suffering or caring more about my moral principles than someone else's suffering. And I think my answer to that has been for a while, and I think I want to stick to is alleviating suffering is a good. It's something that we want to do. But it is a good that is sort of subservient in the sense that there are things that you ought not do even to alleviate suffering. And I think one of those things is murder, whether it's of someone else or of yourself. I think it is proper to conceive of suicide as a kind of self killing or self murder, however we want to nuance that. And so I think obviously I understand it's more reasonable to me why certain people would choose this over others. And I think this is also, again, like what Plato is getting at in the laws, which is like, okay, well, look, if you have some sort of like, I'll see if I can find the quote quickly. I don't want to delay us. Yes, okay. The Athenian stranger provides a legal definition of suicide. Suicide is when a person violently robs his fate-allotted share, that is, ends his life. 2, when he isn't ordered to by the city's judicial decree. 3, nor compelled by some
so
terribly
as long as
painful...
just made it an order instead of just offering it, you'd be cool with it, like, or he would
Well,
be
no,
the
I'm
Athenian
not saying I'm
stranger.
cool with
The
it.
Athenian
No, no, no,
stranger
no.
would be
Hold
like,
on.
okay, cool.
Hold on. No, it doesn't say that what the city is doing is good. It exempts the person from some sort of responsibility.
I was being facetious, but go
No.
ahead.
The third one is compelled by some terribly painful or inescapable bad luck that's befallen him or bad fortune that's befallen him, hasn't been allotted some baffling shame he can't live with. That's a great translation. I love that. Or out of but this is the fifth one. But out of lack of effort and unmanly cowardice inflicts an unjust judicial penalty upon himself. And again, that's probably the most offensive part of the papers. We're not supposed to suggest that suicide could or ever be conceived of as a cowardly act. But I think the intuition the Athenian stranger has is this. We can fully understand why someone with a painful and inescapable bad fortune would desire to end their lives, right? So we can grasp that. We get it. And we can even potentially legally, in this case, excuse that person. I still don't think that that's a person that I want to give a thumbs up to say, oh, okay, in this circumstance, yeah, you're fine. And yeah, I think we have in developed Western countries pretty extensive systems of dealing with end of life care. Most people, even who are dealing with extreme pain and suffering and terminal illness, find comfort in end of life care that we do well. One of the issues is that we often don't do it well. And this is an issue that's dealt with in one of my favorite books now. It's called Being Mortal by 𝕐𝐻. He's a surgeon. He's lived through having his grandfather and then his father in various levels of care. And it's a book just basically about how we live and die in Western medicine. He's Indian, but he operates in a Western context. And he thinks basically like we've created a system that staves off death as long as possible until the suffering is so bad that we feel like, oh, what can you do except like, put this person to sleep until they die or, euthanize them, basically. And so I think he presents an alternative vision that is something that we could achieve by policy or by custom that allows us to more carefully guide people toward death rather than staving it off, and now it's so bad that you've got bone cancer growing through your eye, and now we gotta, inject you with so much morphine that you die. Like that. Like there are middle grounds here, Like we have palliative care. Like most
Sure.
people who die receive some sort of end of life care that is not, we injected you with something to stop your heart, right? So
A little bit of out of left field, but $10 from Pondering Politics to say this. Ask the professor if he listened to the SCOTUS oral arguments about Trump immunity.
I did in fact, and I actually referenced them today because I was doing a review session with my students in my intro political theory class, and we read John Locke's second treatise on government. He has a big section in there where he talks about presidential prerogative, and as far as I take it, I think the argument about immunity is overlapping, at least, with what he says about executive prerogative, which is, yeah, we have an intuition when we have a person at the head of government that we want them to have a wide latitude to do a lot of important things without immediate review. But another thing that Locke says is there's nothing wrong with, later on, the legislative particularly, coming back and saying, hey, that thing that the executive did that technically was in a gray area that we didn't say he could do, but we didn't say he couldn't do it either, they can come back and say, now he can't do that thing ever again. And the idea that Congress could do that seems to be something that even Trump's lawyers are arguing against, which seems really wacky to me. Yeah. So I did listen to it. I don't know that I have well-developed thoughts,
but the intuition is really wacky. Got you.
Yes,
okay.
wacky.
We'll use that quote in our in our thoughts for as we go. I won't touch too much on that. It is beyond the scope of I think what we're going to talk about.
Hey, if somebody wants to call in,
look, yeah, we're going to have call-ins in a few minutes here, so you're always free to come and have a discussion with us because, gang, my intuition also is that it's really wacky. But I do want to kind of steer us a little bit back because I do have a couple final thoughts on the paper itself that I want to kind of run by you or at least question you on. Oh, and he also says to tell you that he loves your mustache. And I want it on the record that before the show began, I also expressed my love for Eukerist's mustache, but I want to do that publicly as well because it's coming in nice, right? You get the Ned Flanders vibe, okay, buddy? And
that's my goal.
It's really kind of pulling
dad
it
life,
out.
you know?
Exactly. But on the topic of the paper, how has it been? I want to ask two questions. One, how has it been received, right, by fellow professors, by others that are involved in this, and things like that, and the community as a whole, such that it is? And two, what was the process like in getting it published and getting this done? How many iterations did you have to go through? I guess more the technical side of these things.
Yeah, I appreciate the prompt. This is great. This is exactly what I wanted to rant about tonight.
I can't tell if that's sarcasm or not, but go ahead.
No, seriously, no, I love this. So as I mentioned earlier, like academic projects typically take longer than you want them to. So it took us longer than we wanted to get a paper ready to send out to journals. But when we started sending it out to journals, this meant we were sending it to basically inside baseball stuff. If you're in political science, there are these things called general interest journals that publish all types of political science. They'll publish international relations, they'll publish American politics, they'll publish comparative politics, and they will publish political theory. Then there are these things called field journals that are specialized in whatever your domain is. And sort of the hierarchy of publishing is like, if you can get in like the best general interest journals, you've peaked, right? These are the journals everyone reads, and so everyone wants to get in them, and that's the best. And so you generally expect when you submit papers, they'll get rejected from those journals because they reject most papers. That's fine. But then you go kind of down the list to like your field journals and then your lesser general journals, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found with this paper was that, well, generally, okay, we got a bunch of desk rejections, which is the norm, again, for academic journals. Like the editor reads it and is like, oh, look, this is good for various reasons, but like we just don't think it fits, so send it to a more specialized journal. That is the norm. But then the couple journals that did send it out initially for reviewers, we got some very interesting reviews, I think. And the most interesting reviews were like, okay, like again, this is a paper that's kind of split, right? It's split between Plato scholarship and application of Plato scholarship, where contemporary
it is. I guess if I had a layman's criticism, is it felt bipolar.
Yeah, absolutely. We do this a lot. We do this a lot. I'll send you another paper that's really good. That's called that's on Aristotle's third unnamed virtue, toleration as a vice. When toleration becomes a vice, you'll love this actually for the topics you were talking about in terms of purity tested communities and things. But so I think it is kind of bipolar in the sense that, yeah, we're doing what we're calling political theory for today. We're taking an old text. We want to give you a really scholarly read of it and then tell you why it matters or why it applies. Like, we're trying to do both, which is hard. It is hard. But the best review, or the most common reviews we got, excuse me, were not the ones that said, oh, the framing doesn't match the content, or, this feels bipolar. It was a disagreement fundamentally with the moral aspect of the paper, which is I take our fundamental moral claim to be suicide is bad and fewer people should do it. And I've learned, again, debated in these spaces, that that's controversial. But I think in the offline world, it's relatively uncontroversial. Everybody who's been touched by suicide thinks I would have preferred that not happen, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So we got one particular review that is like wildly offensive to me, and I think should be offensive to everyone.
Ooh, I'm ready for the spice. Let's bring it. The wildly offensive review. Let's hear it.
And so, like, as I said, like, we're saying we think Plato's view will be particularly useful for veterans. Veterans who are struggling with PTSD might be advantaged by reading Plato's militaristic language about why they should not kill themselves. That might be useful. Maybe. Again, we have no proof of this. We just think maybe it would work. Right? And we got a reviewer who said, well, have the authors considered that it might actually be better for more veterans to kill themselves in the sense that they are alleviating the burdens on an overburdened Veterans Affairs Administration? That was an actual peer review we got from a world-class academic journal. I can't tell you I don't want to tell you the journal, but one of the best academic journals in our field. We got a reviewer who sent that to an editor who said, have they thought even that it would be better for more people to kill themselves? Because I think
it's so overburdened, they can't care for enough, so you might as well
the argument
do your
was
duty,
like,
soldier.
Right?
The
argument was like, look, I understand in the battlefield context why Plato would say you shouldn't drop your shield. Of course, that hurts the people around you. But when you come home and you're suffering from PTSD and you're a drain on the system, like, shouldn't you just off yourself, buddy? That was literally what this review said, and I'm barely paraphrasing. I'll quote the full thing for you sometime. I'll find it. But like so anyways, we went through I think a total of eight journals for this, which is not terribly uncommon. I don't want to develop a persecution complex about this, but we had two different journals that did send it out for reviews where we got some really, I think, really abhorrent reviews back, right? Not saying your scholarship is bad, not saying your argument doesn't follow, but like basically we think it's bad that you think suicide is bad. And that was like, it was really troubling to me, I guess. People can think that, right? This can be an active debate, but I think it's something that should be debated at a scholarly level.
It
like
does
in an ethics journal, or example,
yes,
or
it
whatever,
does.
Right? We should debate the topic.
Look, I know you've been a part of these discussions before, where we talk about ideology and academia and how the two interact, and the hypothesis that many have put forward that the academic institutions have been captured by ideologues in a lot of cases, and they ain't beating the allegations. If you are being, and I have no reason to doubt you right here, you're an honest actor. I think you're a pretty honest guy. But if this didn't just happen once or twice, but this was a pattern of events, right? Where on more than one occasion, the reviews and strikes against you weren't on the academic merit, but on the idea that you were putting forth itself. Like, well, no, I just disagree with your conclusion. I think that's a problem. I think that's indicative of a huge problem. You can think an idea is bad, but if the academic rigor involved was correct, if they followed the procedures, if there was no fudging of data and any of that, things like that, I think that there's no reason to deny the. Anyway, sorry for the rant.
I mean, I've served as a peer reviewer now for, I think, 4 different journals and 2 different university presses. So for papers at 4 different journals and at books at different presses. And there have been several times, I think between those, like there are a few journals I've reviewed for quite a lot, because when they find a reviewer who will accept a lot of reviews, they will keep using you. But there have been quite a few that I've like really disagreed with, like I would guess like the ethical or political implications of the conclusions. But like my review is like, well, maybe the author should consider this, but like, the scholarship is there, it's quality. Like I'm not saying I'm unbiased, and I'm not saying I'm a perfect reviewer, but I would like to think that I wouldn't do what these reviewers did, which is like, well, I have this like ethical disagreement with the conclusion about this topic, and so everything else is kind of irrelevant. I'm just going to hone in on that. And yeah, I mean, the peer review system has its flaws, and I've talked about this before on other streams as well. Like, there are a lot of things, even in empirical fields, that get through that shouldn't. A lot of journals, like there was a journal recently that published a medical text that had like AI generated images that were just so goofy and obvious that anybody who actually read the paper should have caught it, but the reviewers didn't. This stuff exists. But I just, yeah, I don't, yeah, again, I don't want to do a victim complex thing. I just want to say that I have experienced people say, I don't like your thought or your ethics, and so I'm going to chuck it in the garbage bin.
No,
And
that's a
that was
that's a
really
great
annoying.
quote though. Like you can have, I would put that quote like on a fucking t-shirt or something, right? Have these veterans thought about just killing themselves to
That, like,
save the system from bloat.
yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's one for the
Reduce the
record
burden,
books.
like, have you, Wick, I mean, have you, come on, like, have you not, no, sorry.
That's
If the VA added that to
great.
their list of services, would you,
Here, the
would you,
fact.
like,
Okay, I want my viewers to know this. The fact that you view me as a burden only increases my will to live. Okay, it makes me want to be
no,
a burden
I
for
just want to, like,
longer.
you get a
Okay.
pamphlet tomorrow from the VA that's like, would you be interested in receiving more information about dental care, haircuts, maid? Like, which one do you check?
Oh,
Sorry. I'm not.
what
I'm
do I
sorry.
do?
The two thing was too far. I'm sorry.
That's no, it's fine. It's great. At this point, I want you to tell people your closing thoughts, where they can find you, and then, gang, we're gonna do briefly for the next 20 minutes or so. We're gonna have some call-ins. Okay, so if you've questions about this, if you've looked at the paper, if you've listened to us talk, if you have anything to say, if you want to talk to either of us, right, about this topic, please call in. So you can do that by joining the Discord. I'll put in the link in the YouTube, in Twitch or Kick. You put !Discord. You click that link. You accept the rules. You jump backstage. We pull you in. And I will be linking the paper in all the aforementioned places as well. If you'd like to read it sometime, it's a great paper. You should really read it. But Ukerist, go ahead.
Yes.
Give your closing thoughts.
So closing thoughts. I enjoy this paper a lot, and I'm glad we finally got it published. Both because I never thought I would publish scholarship on Plato, which is just like way up there. I wouldn't call myself a Plato scholar, but I've published scholarship on Plato. That's fun now to say. But also because I think this is a real issue.
Thank you for the 5 Kick subscriptions from
dang.
Destroyer of Pussy. Thank you.
Beautiful. The best viewer. But also because I think this is a very relevant issue, and I think it is a political issue. And so what I anticipate in the next decade is that this will become an issue state by state in the U.S. I think it will not stick to the West Coast. I think states in the U.S. will start hearing proposals for bills legalizing certain forms of euthanasia, and I expect that, as it usually does, at some point to lead to some sort of federal consideration policy, some Supreme Court case, etc. And I want more people who are actively thinking about this on in terms of ethics, in terms of politics, in terms of history, in terms of, as Wick said, the incentives that we're building into these sorts of systems. I want the discourse to be better than it would be otherwise. And so I hope that this paper can contribute to that kind of conversation. I don't know if anybody will read it or care about it, but that's the goal. In terms of where
I
you
read
can
it
find,
and I care, and so fair enough.
I
Go ahead.
appreciate it deeply. In terms of where you can find me, I've been slacking off lately, but I blog sometimes on Substack at everythingwasbeautiful.substack.com. It's a Vonnegut quote. I love Vonnegut. So usually I'll just like post some random essays I come up with, or just books that I'm reading, but I've been slacking off for a couple months, so I'll get back to that in the summer. This has been a very busy semester. I'm on Twitter as well. I don't know. I won't say my Twitter handle for the VOD. You can find me on Wick's Twitter if you follow Wick. That's all I care. That's all I care about. But yeah, so I mean, I don't really stream. I don't get on panels a lot anymore, except when I'm really mad. But mostly the Substack is what I do in terms of content creation now, and I hope to sort of devote more time to that in the future. So.
Gang, give his Substack another subscriber. He's great. We really appreciate having you on. And gang, for the next 20 minutes or so, you can talk to this man and ask him anything you'd like about his paper, about his Substack, about the concept in general. If you have problems, if you have issues, if you'd like to challenge him, now's the time, gang. I put the link to the Discord in the YouTube chat and in the Twitch chat. Please click those links. Please accept the rules, and we'll pull you in. And we got your favorite fan already. Okay, there is
He's a beautiful man.
he is a beautiful man. You are his idol. Okay, he talks about you. The only person he talks about more is President Sunday. Okay, the only person he talks about more is President Sunday.
Don't say his name. You'll summon him.
So here he is. Origin, hi. You're live.
Am I live?
Yep. What you got?
All right, Eucharist. I reread your paper about a few hours ago.
Reread. We're flexing off the start. I appreciate it.
Well, I did. I mean, I have a question though in regards to the one aspect of the paper, and that is the part where you argue. Well, you don't argue. You acknowledge that Plato, in the laws, argues that in some cases, maybe the best way to handle the suicide issue is to send out the bodies of the suicide people and send them out of society and buried in unmarked graves. And if we leave it like secret and unseen like that, maybe that will in some ways influence the society as a large to not want to take part in taking suicide, because a lot of people who commit suicide usually
You're
this is
cutting out a
generally
little
speaking,
bit.
they're all like, oh, I can't take it anymore, life is too hard. Oh, I am.
Yeah,
Nope,
just a little.
I think you're good now. I think it's
How about
straightened
now?
out.
You're
Yep,
fine.
you're good
Go
now.
ahead.
All right, cool. So one of the main reasons I think people commit suicide these days is because they feel that life is too hard to bear. And what would your thoughts be on the whole, like, if we had to consider what Plato acknowledges in the laws, like, would it be efficient to maybe start imposing that as a law, that if people commit suicide, maybe we should bury them in unmarked graves outside of the society?
I think that what I find compelling about that particular law is the intuition that dwelling on the act of suicide brings this kind of contagion, or as he calls it, miasma. I think that obviously, like we all today, I think would be shocked by the idea that we should, take any person who has killed themselves and put them out of our cultural memory, right? Like I love David Foster Wallace and Ernest Hemingway both, and a bunch of other people who have killed themselves. And so the idea that we would like take everything they've ever done and purge it from the record, I think is too far for us. I think the question is sort of the like what is the goal or the intuition there? And I think the goal or the intuition is we've got to find some way to purge or purify the bad thing that's happened. And so the Athenian stranger says, like, I can't think of any way to do this, but like, actually, no, what he says is, the best way to deal with that, the God only knows. Like, he literally says, like, only God knows how to actually deal with the hurt and the pain that suicide brings. But in terms of politics, what we can do is, in certain circumstances, not remember the fact that this person did it. And then again, like the caveats I listed for Wick, there's two different ways that people have taken those caveats. Some people take them as like very high bar threshold of like almost no suicide would ever meet these thresholds. But the most common interpretation is like these are actually fairly low. Like these are most of the reasons that people kill themselves. And so it seems like there's a both and proposition that we want in the city a law that discourages suicide, that says you should not do this, and if you do, your memory will be effaced. But you want, as part of that law, also the compassion of, oh, well, actually, we can understand why that person did it, so we're not going to mete out the full justice on this person kind of thing. And so operating as we do in a world that we don't have this concept of pollution, right? We don't think, like, here's, 45 units of pollution we've got to purify from this murder. Oh, no, here's 100 units of pollution we've got to purify from this suicide, right? We don't think in these terms. I think it's best to try to analogize or adapt and say, like, what is the best way we can adapt the intuition here? which is like, okay, dwelling on suicide, bad. So maybe don't put it in headlines. Maybe don't glorify it. Maybe don't record it. Maybe don't post, like again, like the self-immolation guy. Like maybe there are things that we can say, hey, you probably ought not do that in terms of publicizing, right? But in terms of like actually meting out the anonymity on the individual, yeah, like I'm not gonna drive down to wherever David Foster Wallace is buried and blow up his tombstone and try to burn all his books. I certainly won't do that. Yeah.
Oh, I'm not asking you that if you would do that. I'm asking merely if
Would
that
you
it
be
would be
okay
an
if the
actual.
state did
The
it?
reason I asked that is because the reason I asked that question is when I read your paper at first, it's kind of like how I was actually, because I haven't read Plato's Laws. It's one of the many dialogues I haven't read yet, and so I came across really something you were thinking. And then
Okay,
it
you're a
comes with
robot,
that issue
dude.
where
You
there's a
become
caveat that it has
AI.
to be.
Yeah, you're cutting out. I'm sorry.
Whatever you're saying, it's just the robots
It's like
have
half
got
in and
you.
half out.
Okay, the machine has you. It's
Maybe
taking
it's
you.
maybe I have to talk about it later.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah,
don't
message
know
me,
if this will
message me.
do. Okay, Origin. I'm sorry, buddy.
Yeah, you're good. Oh no.
Another day.
Wow.
Another day.
Well, it was a good question. I think he has the right intuition, which is like, I think obviously like to copy paste the laws of Plato or that the Athenian stranger puts forward would be
silly.
abhorrent to us, right? Like,
Yeah.
So we can't do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, but we can't take, to your point, we can't take kind of like the core of it, the concept behind it, like the reason that they made this law, what they were trying to intend to accomplish by putting this law forward. And I think that that does bear consideration. Again, I'm torn on this, right? Like, it is in the public interest to know when someone has taken their life, right? Yeah, I think that there is this idea of the public has an interest in knowing these things and being aware of these things. When a brutal murder takes place, it is in public interest to know that it took place, right? It's in public interest to know who did it as well, right? And that is a competing interest with the evidence we have of how, quote unquote, drawing attention to these things increases the likelihood of these things. And we know that's true, right? We know that there is an increased likelihood at the idealization of suicide, not just suicide, but of things like mass murder, of mass shootings and things like that. We know is a thing that happens. And so, but there's a tension there, and we can talk about it. I saw another person backstage briefly before we brought on Origin. Gang, now is the time to shine. If you want to talk, to us, if you have questions, if you've been watching the stream, if you want me to take my hood down baldy, as Average Gatsby has asked, right? You can do that, right? You can come in and talk to us directly about this topic.
Harass you.
I'm down for it. Right? It's good content.
On the on the analogizing thing, I think all the evidence I've read suggests that like there's something about celebrity suicides particularly that is pernicious, that like there tends to be a sort of contagion effect, or there's lethal sloth. Okay, I'll stop.
No, you don't have to stop. We can just bring them in. You can finish your thought and then you can ask your question.
I want other people's questions.
Okay, other people's questions. Lethal sloth, hello, you're live.
Hello. Yeah, just a quick question. Do you make a distinct difference between made or letting someone die? Because not to get too personal, but I had some grandparents who were basically in a coma and non-responsive to anything, but they were kept alive a really long time. And I don't have a personal opinion on that, because I find that thematic very difficult to grapple. But do you make a distinction that there's just some time where we should pull the plug, basically?
Yeah. I would say I think like in the US, right, most states do not have any sort of like assisted dying or assisted suicide, but we do have end of life care that can involve withdrawal of care. And so like my wife is an ICU nurse, and so there are lots of people in her field who submit like do not resuscitate orders. Like if something happens, like don't give me everything you can to keep my heart beating, like just let me go. Or people on a DNR who get put on certain life support technologies is like, okay, well, if it requires anything more than this, like yeah, just go ahead and pull the plug. And so I think ethically we can distinguish between like withdrawal of care and just saying, okay, like this person's natural functions are shutting down, and we're going to let that happen, versus like I'm going to actively intervene and speed it up when it would not happen otherwise. It's just like, you know, their suffering is so bad, I'm going to inject them with whatever drug that speeds their heart stopping, as opposed to withdrawing that care and keeping them as comfortable as possible. I think like this is like, it is a tension though, I think, in medical ethics, which is like you want to make people as comfortable as possible, while maybe not prolonging suffering, and both of those things can be kind of in tension. Like you like, you know, people, we think, okay, well, I'm getting hungry, and so that sucks. If I'm starving, that's painful. But what I've been told from people who work in palliative care is that for people at a certain age and a certain level of physical degradation, that hunger is just not experienced the same way. They'll just kind of stop eating and don't desire it in the same way. I think that's kind of what happened with my grandma, as she was kind of fading. But yeah, so I would distinguish that, right? So you've got your, you know, grandma on a vent, and you know it's the only thing keeping her alive. She's kind of non-responsive, and she's not recovering. Like withdrawal of care there, I think is ethically different than MAID or intervening to kill. Where are you from, by the way? I'm just curious.
Germany.
Germany. Okay. What part of Germany, if you don't mind me asking?
Very in the middle.
Okay, my mom and my grandmother are from Trier, so the accent sounded, you know, German, so I was just curious.
Yeah, I have a aggressive accent.
Man,
No,
knowing you have German ancestry puts that mustache into context. Now I'm not so
dude,
sure I like it. But go on.
the only thing I resent my mom for is not teaching me German. I'm so upset. Wow.
Is there
Uh,
anything else you had before we
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question, because I thought a little about that, and I also came to the similar-ish conclusion. But there's this whole spiel always with not doing something is basically the same as, or allow something to happen is the same as doing it yourself. Because I would basically make no distinction. There's always that example with a kid is drowning in a bathtub.
Right.
And letting that child die is basically the same as killing it, because you have the capacity to stop that from happening. And yeah. And
Yeah.
to the
sorry.
thematic as before, if I have that stance that I say, okay, if I let someone die while I could help, it's basically the same as killing them.
Yeah. So
And then to the question before, you can see where this is going. Is there a kind of conflict that would appear as basically letting someone die as being the same as MAID?
Yeah, so I would say like in the case of my grandma, for example, who's sort of fading, right? There were a lot of things that could have done, machines that could have hooked her up to artificially prolong her life. But she kind of was not eating as much. She wasn't feeling as well. She was laying around a lot. Like, you know, this is what she wanted, and we're kind of just like making her comfortable while that process happens. But if she got up to go to the bathroom and, you know, was about to like fall on a bed of nails or something, right? I would rescue her, right? Because there's something happening that is actively intervening to hasten that death. And I would sort of analogize that to the drowning situation, where it's like, okay, yeah, the question is like a combination of what can I actually affect and what's the sort of natural processes going on. And when someone's organs are failing, when their life is ending, their body is warring against them, we can use certain technologies to fix that. And we do that sometimes with the goal of restoring health, right? We do this with like cancer treatment with the goal of like, oh yeah, 10, 20 years from now, if we can fix this cancer problem, your body will be operating better than it would have been, and normally perhaps even. But with somebody who's in end of life care, it's like your body is not healing, right? This is why somebody chooses a do not resuscitate order. It's like, if you do CPR on me, you will break ribs that will never heal before I die, and I will suffer until I die, even if you restart my heart. And so like I think the reason this is ethically difficult to talk about is that we have many people have different intuitions about I guess what I would call teleology, like studies of things according to ends and health and function. That like, if my body is fundamentally shutting down and there's nothing that can really be done for it, I don't think there's anything ethically wrong with just saying, okay, I'm not gonna like slow that process. But if something in extremis is happening that I could prevent, I probably do have a responsibility to try to fix that. Yeah.
Okay.
Now that, I mean, it gets tricky when it's like, oh yeah, well, somebody who has cancer is like, I don't want treatment. Because even though the treatment, like, Steve Jobs or somebody who's like, I'm going to drink, kale shakes instead of get my treatable colon cancer treatment. Is that guy doing a suicide? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, it gets complicated, I think, very tricky. But I think medical ethics in the US has figured this out to an extent, which is like, yeah, there are certain people that we will make comfortable while their bodies shut down. And there are certain people that we think, yeah, we could restore function to the point that they'd be healthy again or more healthy. Yeah.
Yeah, I get it. A lot of gray area where it's
Yeah.
just hard to tell.
Yeah. I appreciate the question. I think it's a good one, and it's I think one of the most important questions to ask anybody who's opposed to this stuff is like, I think people who are fundamentally opposed to MAID, like I am, need to grapple with end of life care more. Like they need to know more of what it is actually like, how it actually works for the families, and the bad cases. Like they need to know these things of like, yeah, here's my granny with bone cancer growing through the back of her eye in the U.S. and she couldn't get MAID. Like why? Like I think it's important to deal with. So yeah, I appreciate it.
Because a little bit personal history, I had a grandmother who was dement for a long time.
Yeah.
And it was not nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where that comes from.
Yeah.
It's
No,
a
understand that.
tragedy. But thank you for calling in. I appreciate you coming by.
I'm
thank you.
𝐻𝑒daddle out of here. Thank you
A
for
great day.
everything.
What a nice caller. What a good caller.
So nice.
We have time for maybe one more if someone wants to hop in. Otherwise, we'll just kind of
what was I saying before?
You had a whole spiel lined up, and then
I was preparing.
stopped yourself.
God, well, you brought something up after Origin. You brought something up after Origin. What was it?
About laws and how we can't just copy paste these laws and how our circumstances have changed, but we can look at the principle behind the laws and see what they were trying to accomplish and the intent behind it, and maybe put that into practice. Was that something?
Maybe. Oh, Corey's here. Oh, Corey's gonna hit me.
Our few.
Speaking of bodily autonomy,
yes.
I've never seen a more bodily autonomous man in my life than Corey Campbell. Oh my goodness.
Corey, good evening. You're live.
Well, thank you for having me. Although, to be perfectly frank, I did not, unfortunately, get to catch the entire conversation. Although what I did catch was obviously, as always, interesting. Ukerist always has great things to say, great perspectives.
Reprehensible things to say as well. Oh, yeah.
Well, your words, not mine. So you might have covered this. So I apologize if this is like a repeat. But I'm curious. Okay. I know that you are fundamentally opposed to like MAID and essentially suicide. So if or when, okay, we get to the point in whatever hundreds of years from now that we live forever, are we allowed to kill ourselves?
I don't have a good answer for this, because it's very difficult for me to conceive of a world where cessation of bodily function is no longer on the table.
Well, even I can maybe whittle away of like, if we get to the point of like 200-year lifespan, can someone call it quits after 100? Like, is that also illegitimate to you? Of 150 years, just like.
I think it is legitimate for somebody to refuse intervention that would prolong their life. So if we had like a magic pill that would extend my life 100 years tomorrow, and somebody didn't want to take it, I would think of that differently than the active choice to commit suicide or take advantage of MAID. And so if I mean, this is I guess this is kind of the ethical dilemma that you see in no spoilers, sorry, but the final season of The Good Place. Where you have eternity on the table and you have the option of annihilation available to you, and Chidi eventually says, yeah, I've kind of exhausted what I want to do with my intellect, and I just would prefer not to be conscious anymore, and chooses that. I react emotionally and morally against that choice, actually, like what even in the context of the show, where like the afterlife is not not the kind of thing that I even or would prefer. I still like look at his choice, being in paradise with his, lifetime love, and choosing annihilation over her, I find it reprehensible. So I guess I would have to be forced to say, yeah, even if we had this hypothetical, eternal immortal lifespan, that choosing to kill yourself would be bad. But
you can live forever.
Do the elves in the Lord of the Rings have the right to?
You can live
well,
forever.
no, that's very different. That's very
Here's the
different
thing,
because
Ukerist, you can live forever, but every day you have to tweet out something, right? You have to make a tweet on social media every day, or you die. And if someone chooses not to tweet,
I would prefer
is that suicide, right?
No, well, oh, geez. Oh, wait, is that yes, maybe? Oh, gee. You just have to tweet anything? Like, I'm not being forced to say something controversial? I can just tweet anything?
Well, say you are first to say that hashtag Wick is the greatest every day, okay? Wick is the greatest every day.
If you made me tweet the N-word or I would die, I'd die. That's
really? You would choose... Well, look, because if someone put a gun to my head and said tweet the N-word or you're dead, I'm hard R-ing it, baby. It's going on my timeline.
Corey brought up Lord of the Rings. The elves sailing to the Undying Lands is quite different, okay? Because that's sailing to paradise, okay? Rather than like okay, if Bilbo was like, or sorry, Frodo was like, oh, my shoulder just still hurts, and just like dove on his sword, right? Very different than sailing to the Undying Lands. Which.
But my question is, like, do the elves have the right to refuse to go to the Undying? And just say, hey, like, I'm okay. after a millennia, I'm kind of fed up.
I think this is a difference in ethical intuition that we have on this topic that has come up a few times, which is like Arwen choosing to live a mortal life, knowing that she will die. I think is different than the suicide that I think is morally problematic, in the sense that I do think there are cases where somebody can do something that can even foreseeably lead to their death, that I would not put in the same category. And among these, I put like, battlefield conduct of like, diving on a grenade or something like that, right? Sure. I would not put that in the same category, because as I said earlier to Wick, my intuition is like alleviating human suffering is mostly good, but there are things you ought not do even to alleviate suffering, and one of those is killing yourself or someone else to alleviate that suffering. And so I think in whatever ethical system I'm trying to figure out here, admit of better or worse motives for doing something that would reasonably lead to your death. Like, I think we all have what my co-author on this paper calls fundamental cares, the things that we put above everything, right? I ask my students this at the beginning of every semester, like, what, if anything, would you be willing to die for, potentially? And weirdly enough, the second one that they always say is their pets, and I get really mad about that. But family is almost always first. Pets are second, friends are third, and then maybe somewhere down the line you get faith, country, and everything else.
I'm going to be real with you. Like, if someone... I've said this before on my stream, right? Unfortunately, Tinkerbell passed away a few weeks ago, and that's very sad. But if it had been it was a result of just illness, but if it had been a result of someone attacking her, I would either be in the hospital, I would be in the grave, or I would be in jail. One of those places I would be. And I don't think it's out of pocket for people to think. It is
not out of pocket. I've learned this is not out of pocket. I would just say, like, if my house is on fire and my wife and my children were safe and I knew my dog was still inside, I would never run back in to get her. I would maybe call her and open the door and do everything. I would never run back into a fire to get her. But my relationship with my dog is very different than your relationship with Tinkerbell, and I'm very sorry about that. I'm not condemning you for your...
I need to check your freezer now. I'm very concerned.
But, if I'm running out of the house and I can grab her, great. But there are other people and things I might grab.
Would you grab your book first?
Oh, I'm curious. I'm curious. If there was... Okay, if it was a choice between your dog and you just happen to have some really awful criminal in your house, are you running back in at all? And if so, which one are you choosing?
No, I definitely value, I think, abstract human life over my dog's life. And I think if I had a reasonable expectation
would you kill a dog to save a human?
Well, I mean, yeah, in the sense that like if my dog bit my daughter tomorrow, I would have no hesitation about
Sure,
putting it
sure, but
down. Yeah.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about say someone
Oh,
came up to you.
the freshman
Yeah.
philosophy: kill the dog or the person. Yes, I'd kill the dog. Yes,
You
100%.
kill the dog.
Um,
Interesting. Okay.
Wait,
yeah,
wait,
yeah.
wait, no. We're gonna go real philosophy. You have two entities hanging off of a building, one in each arm. One's a dog, one is Hitler. Which one are you saving?
Hitler. Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
fair enough.
I
Um,
I do rank the image of God over the dog in that case. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Fair enough. But
God.
I don't
And
agree
then
with it, but
I'd shoot
I
Hitler
respect.
afterwards for the crime. No.
So yeah, it's interesting. I pose the same question to you, Wicca. Like, if or when we get to immortality, or like 500 years lifespan, like,
Sure, I don't
do
think
they
there's
have?
ever an ethical point where simply due to boredom you are okay to kill yourself.
That is so.
So even
Yeah,
after 10,000 years of existence, simply the act of simply not wanting to cease to be is not enough to make suicide ethical.
okay. Yeah, that is a fundamental. So I'm glad I asked the question because I think that's the fundamental disagreement. Like, I think if someone's lived
Perhaps.
for 10 millennia, and they just don't want to go on living anymore, I don't think you're really obligated to live at that point. But I do understand I think I understand all of Eucharist's
Wait, so
concerns.
what about if they're only 10 though? Like they've only lived 10 years. Like if there is a point where someone could just be so tired of existing, what is that line? Is it 10 years? Is it 20? Is it 200? Where is the line for you? Do you think a 10-year-old could just be like, I don't want to live anymore and should be able to ethically end their life?
Well, if you're asking ethically versus whatever, morally, legally, or I guess ethically
Morally,
versus.
right? Like, would you be if you a random 10-year-old comes up to you? I don't know why they would, right? Maybe they're on Twitch or something,
Yeah,
right?
don't frame it this way, please. I don't like this is going, but I understand your point. So I can use a more concrete example.
Sure,
So
sure.
there's a great documentary called The Life of Sam. And The Life of Sam documents this individual that is unfortunately, well, they've passed away since, but they suffer from progeria. And progeria is essentially known as the accelerated aging disease. So like typically, these children have lifespans about, I think the longest lived one is I think like 20, 22 or something. But they tend to essentially have rapidly accelerated aging, tend to die of heart attack, stroke, certain cardiovascular diseases, and it's a beautiful documentary, really sad. And I'm open to the possibility of like if Sam towards the end of his life, knowing that like yeah he's only got a couple years left, but he doesn't want to spend it suffering, if in conjunction with his parents, obviously, and guardians, I can make the ethical case for that, or I'm open to that question, for sure. But like your random 10-year-old, like yeah, no, I'm obviously less close to
I
that.
have like I don't know. I understand the intuition, and again, like I try to understand it as best as I can, but I also, one of my issues is one of contingency in these medical situations, where like I have a friend who's a student. I was an RA in my undergrad, and he was a student in my wing who has cystic fibrosis. And
Mhm.
the prognosis for people with cystic fibrosis in the past like 10, 20 years has improved dramatically, even without like lung
Yep.
transplants. Like it used to be, you need a lung transplant or you're going to die, sub 30. And now it's like, well, even without a lung transplant, you're doing quite well. And with a lung transplant, you're doing better, et cetera, et cetera. And so somebody like that with sort of like long term, like yeah, really like horrendous illness that I would obviously not want to live with. Like I just question the temporality part of it, which is like, I mean, it's the old cliche, the old suicide prevention line of like, don't take a permanent solution to a temporary
Temporary
problem,
problem.
Yeah,
The
but
cure
so
could be tomorrow, right?
well, yes, in a sense, and I'm not. I
I
don't want
know,
to put
technically
the
speaking, it is correct. Yes.
I don't want to put the hypothetical cure as like an ethical obligation on somebody, but I do want to say like the general intuition, regardless of those extreme circumstances, should be like this is not a thing that we favor or approve of or endorse or as Wick said earlier, like lower the barriers of the friction to. Like this is a thing that I think generally we ought to raise the friction to, if we want to discourage it generally. Where like again, like I think Canada is like an interesting case where it's like, yeah, the goal was like let's lower the barriers for these extreme cases, and it seems more so than the European regimes that have done the same thing to have been like, well, it's not just the extreme cases anymore. It seems to be uh, uh not a default setting is too strong, but a more intuitive choice for people who could have led relatively decent lives otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah.
Have veterans ever considered, they're releasing or lessening the friction to helping the VA be more
Right.
uh,
Have you thought about the
yeah,
burden on the Veterans Affairs
exactly.
Administration in the U.S.,
I don't know if
Corey?
you were here for
Have you
that
considered
part,
this?
Corey.
I don't know.
But that was so the reason we're talking, Mr. Corey, is because our friend Ukerist here published a paper.
Yeah, no,
have
and
you read
I'm
it?
interested in reading it. I've not read it because
You
he didn't send it
should.
to me.
One of the
But
one of the things that one of the reviewers came back with though was they had an issue with the paper, and I'm gonna paraphrase a little bit here, but he can give you the direct quote, which was basically, well, you talk about veterans committing suicide as if that's a bad thing. Have veterans considered committing suicide to ease the burden on the VA? That was a peer reviewer who gave him that note. So yeah.
well, let's just say I think peer review in his field is different than peer review in my field. And,
Yeah.
Is it, Corey? Is
well,
it?
fair,
You have a
fair,
replication crisis. There's no
Well,
replication crisis in the humanities because nobody can replicate the shit that I do. We just talk about books, okay?
It's also no offense. I'm not sure. Like I could be wrong, but how many people are working to replicate what you do, Ukerist?
Literally no one.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. There's no replication
No
crisis.
offense taken. Literally no one.
But yeah, like, and this is absolutely in no way to denigrate what you do. I think what you do is super important. Although I certainly have some criticisms in terms of whatever academia and all that stuff. But I guess to maybe get more of the topic like at hand, it's like, yeah, like I think it might just be a matter, at least from my intuition. Okay, and I don't know your life history, and I know, okay, that Wick, this seems to be like a personal topic for you because like you've been affected by it. You've been pretty transparent about that, at least from what I can tell, like directly affected. But like I'm just because like, but it's also personal to me because like I can imagine a scenario of like being in such immense suffering from my own condition that is like, yeah, if I ever get to the point where I can't walk and I can't eat, and that's realistically in the cards for me, and that like I might have some vision problems, like. Yeah, I want the right to call it quits, for sure. Just as the same person, that Life of Sam documentary, like I think it's totally valid if a person in that scenario wants to end it. And I do think, okay, I'm curious if there's if you want to like run the poll, like who thinks you're obligated to like if we live to like for 10,000 years, like yeah, or like we live forever, you're just obligated to live and just live for the sake of living. I think even you, Eucharist, you understand that like living for the sake of living, I think probably is not like the best guiding principle. Like we just continue living for the sake of it, and there is nothing else to cultivate.
Yeah, no, but I would, I think, reject the intuition that like I think I'm kind of forced to accept this. I mean, somebody in the chat is saying, "Oh, it's the theology of God regarding suicide." And I mean, not exactly. Like I'm trying to pull from sources that are not in my tradition that have similar intuitions. Where I told Wick earlier, I'm not going to read from it, but I pulled a book off the shelf just in case anybody did this nonsense. I have this book on ethics by Alain Badiou, who's a French philosopher who's radical atheist, Marxist, whatever, and he has a whole section against suicide and euthanasia. And so I think there are perfectly legitimate non-theological reasons to oppose these things. I would also just say, like, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Can you restate what you like? Just living for the sake of living. Can you restate? There was something about what you just said that just like triggered a thing in my brain.
Well, yeah, as in like, well, I think ultimately, fundamentally speaking, I think we're sort of on the same page. I think of like living the good life, so to speak, without defining what that is, and that if you're just like hanging on for the sake of hanging on, like and you're not necessarily pursuing the good life per se, yeah. It's like that doesn't seem like the most optimal scenario at all. And it's like, then what do you? And especially if you lived literally 1,000 years, it's like, well, yeah, that seems. Can't I fully articulate like what exactly is off there, but something seems off there for me.
I would say I kind of agree. I would want to reject the idea, I think, that people in certain circumstances of like suffering or despondency are not living for something or could not live for something. I wouldn't want to foist this upon someone else as like a normative imperative. You have to like bear with some kind of suffering to improve yourself or whatever. But I do think we see lots of examples in history, and again, like particularly within my tradition, being a Christian, I think like the suffering saints. Well, it begins with Jesus, obviously, but I think that's a kind of a very important thing, that like that there is value realized through suffering. I think that's something that's common between Stoic tradition and Christian tradition, and a bunch of other traditions, that like some kind of suffering can bring about some sort of character transformation.
I think, if I may, this becomes a question of what responsibility do you have to your community, to your culture, to your society, right? Do you have a responsibility to live for your society? And I think the answer for me, at least, is yes, to some extent, right? That you have the obligation to make the world a better place. It's not a huge obligation, right? But there is that obligation. If you see something and you have the power to make it right, you should make it right. What suicide does, what killing yourself does, is it removes your power. It removes your ability to affect the world for positive or negative, right? And so it does, again, remove, like, you are failing at your obligation. You are failing at your responsibility, your general responsibility that you have. I think that, like, people do this every day, right? They fail at this every day without committing suicide, right? Every time you see something and you can affect the world for better, but you choose not to, you are failing in a certain sense. But suicide is kind of like the finality of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't think I have any realist. I would maybe just reframe it as like I do think that there's a sense of responsibility. I don't know that I would go so far as obligation. For me, that's, I guess, more on a case-by-case basis, I suppose. But I do take your point. Like, I believe in, helping others. If you're in a position to help others, you are. I can maybe go so far as to say you're obligated to do that. But also at the same time, I don't know that every person, like, I think you open the door of like, well, if you're not living up to that obligation, or you're just like physically incapable, I think I think many people that want to pursue MAID, some of it is driven by, it's like they feel like a burden. And like, if you're framing everything of like, if you are not,
one of the reasons they may feel like a burden is because the state has told them that they are.
I don't know what you mean by state has told them.
So
but
when, again, Ukerist said this probably more poetically than I could, but when you make a list of lives where you are improving their ability to end their lives, or for the state to provide assistance to end their lives, what you're doing is you're making a list of people that lives are a burden and don't matter. That's what you're doing.
Sure. I take that. I mean, almost inherently, to some extent, like, given the fact that we have public health care, like, if we're boiling everything down to an economic calculus, like, we're going to be
Which is
a burden.
I don't think it is just an economic calculus, though, right? It's supposed to be kind of a moral calculus, which is like, there are certain kinds of lives that we conceive of as being the ones that normal people might not want to live, and so we want to give them this pathway. It's not like Canada is very explicitly trying not to market this as like, well, we're relieving a burden on our national healthcare system. We're giving an option to people who meet certain qualifications to opt out of life, as you're describing. But they're also doing it in a way that does, like, the most strong moral cases that I've heard are from, well, I don't know if you've taken this strong line, Corey, but close to there, but people like Prime, who have just like a fundamental bodily autonomy argument, which is just like, yeah, this should be a policy option available to anyone who reasonably opts into it, maybe with certain normal checks. But the goal of the Canadian advances since 2016, as far as I understand them, is to say, well, let's figure out what circumstances somebody is living a life that is so bad that we can understand why they wouldn't want to live, and then give them the permission. And that's what I'm saying, is sort of like incentivizing this, or like giving a thumbs up to it.
Yeah, no, I understand there's sort of a tacit endorsement, well, at a state level. But I'm curious. So, and I think I take your point in terms
I'm
of.
Here, I'm just gonna turn off my camera for a second.
Yeah, no, I understand. So I would say, okay, that I recognize all of the potential pitfalls that the Canadian system has, in terms of they're totally people that, as a result of their economic and their material conditions, they are essentially driven to pretty much get MAID. And I think there are actual, essentially documented cases of, like, since this person couldn't access the appropriate material conditions, they're just like, well, yeah, and they were approved. and I don't view that as a good thing. But the if I can maybe add some sort of positive spin to it, morbidly speaking, of at least, okay, I would say you have made in the United States. You just don't call it made. You just call it deaths of despair. Okay, where can you tell me you have about approximately, lowballing conservatively, about 150,000 people that died in the United States of opioid-related deaths, alcohol, suicide, etc. How many of those would you say are essentially people intentionally killing themselves? And how many do you think are driven by material conditions? Do you have any numbers on that?
I don't have any specific percentage to give you. I would say that most, if not all, of these are preventable deaths. And I think that the difference between us and Canada is rather than make policy to ease that process along and make it kinder and gentler, we simply at least, whether we're actually doing that or not is a different question. What we ought to do is fight against it and say, no, we're going to bring this number down to 0 or as close to 0 as we can.
Yeah, but I think the fact that from what I can tell, you've held at least 3 panels or 3 or 4 conversations about Made in Canada. I don't think you've held any panel about deaths of despair in the United States.
We did one on the opioid crisis. Does that count?
I think it's associated. It's
loosely.
Okay.
It's
I would participate if you want to do a panel on deaths of despair in the United States. I would gladly get on it. I would say the difference is that, like, while I think you're right, the proportional airtime given to those is not proportional. I would be opposed to any policy that cements deaths of despair as an option, right? It's like, oh well, yeah, if you feel like that, well, probably you should.
Well, no, all I'm highlighting is, I would say it's easy to point the finger at Canada, but I would say again, if there's any sort of like glimmer or like
easy and morally correct, but carry on.
Yeah, but like at least now, okay, our dirty laundry, and I have no problem saying that, is being aired out. Like, yeah, we now know that there are people seeking it out as a result of the, and you just don't talk about it. Literally, you don't really hold panels on it. You'll talk about opioid deaths, but like, yeah, deaths of despair. Well, no, let's go to Canada. But you have made, you just don't call it that.
Well, here's the thing. I don't think I can find anyone who would like hear on or to advocate for this, right? Like, I'm happy to do a show on this. Can you find me some proponents of this?
No. Well, first of all, where you're having a one-on-one conversation,
because I'm having proponents.
Like, you're not,
well, okay.
you don't,
even if I can find one person to have a I just want. Look.
Right,
next time we'll find you somebody to talk about to solve deaths of despair. We can talk about that.
Okay,
we'll find somebody to talk about that. No, I think it's fair, Corey. I think you're right. Like, I do have a book on my shelf, the deaths of despair.
I know you do. I know you take it seriously. I'm just highlighting, like, Wick seems to be understandably, very narrowly focused, but like, yeah, no airtime. I'm not saying
it's because of United States supremacy. Okay, we wear you as a hat for a reason. Okay.
No. You're a bottom for a reason, actually, to refrain.
Okay. Finish your point, then I do have to end this because I want to go see a movie.
I understand.
Tonight, so.
And I appreciate you letting me on. But like, yeah, like, I don't want to encourage death, and I think generally speaking, yeah, my guiding principle is like life is worth living, but I can totally foresee that for some people, even for myself, there will be probably a point that life is no longer worth living. But also at the end of the day, when it comes to like policy, it's like, yeah, MAID should ideally, in my world, only be reserved for those who like is pretty much, on death's door. But I also recognize that, there are other circumstances that can understandably lead people to wanting to kill themselves. But I want to highlight again, pretty much my overall arching point is like, you just brush it under the rug and you don't talk about it. Okay, you literally have people offering themselves as a result of material conditions, but it's literally not talking about on these panels or these shows. And I'm not saying you need to get someone who's pro deaths of despair, but you can have a one-on conversation with like Ukerist of like, hey, how bad is it in the United States? Instead of saying, hey, how bad is it in Canada? Let's point fingers. You totally can point fingers at Canada, but you just don't want to air your dirty laundry in the United States. You want to air our dirty laundry. But
I will recommend a book that touches on. It actually crosses over several counties I grew up in by Barbara Kingsolver called Demon Copperfield. That's like it's a U.S. adaptation of Demon Copperhead. Sorry, U.S. adaptation of
I was about to say, is
David
this
Copperfield.
magic or something? But go
No,
on.
no,
Yeah.
Demon Copperhead. It's like David Copperfield, but U.S. Opioid epidemic. And so I grew up northeastern Tennessee, right over the border from Virginia. A lot of the book takes place right over that border on the southwest side of Virginia. And like I knew people who grew up this way. It's a very like humanizing fictional story, semi-fictional. Most of it is very real. Of the opioid crisis and the kind of people who get wrapped up in this. I think Corey is correct that like we have the same demographic of people who are opting into not living anymore through various means. I just would, if the government of Virginia was like, well, we have so many people offing themselves with opioids, we might as well have an institutionalized regime where people who feel like life isn't worth living can have a smoother path. I would oppose that in the same way I oppose Canada's and just the opioid crisis in general. But I think you're right. I think it's something that is important to talk about, which is the underlying causes of why people are feeling this way. Why are suicide rates going up?
Right.
Why are overdoses going up? Those sorts of things. Yeah. 100%.
And that's why, at the very least, I'm glad you're totally it's totally valid to point the fingers at Canada, but you're pointing the fingers at Canada because we are being transparent about it. Like, yeah, it's on the table. We have people seeking out MAID because of the material conditions, and you just don't talk about it because it's like you don't have this system, because you can just brush under the rug and it all falls under the category of deaths of despair, and you're not showing your dirty laundry. At least Canada is, and at least you're literally having the conversation over and over and over again, which I don't think is a bad thing. But no surprise, you're not talking about what's going on in the United States, which is effectively the same thing.
Well, speaking of what we're going to talk about next week, we got some great shows for you. On Monday, we're going to talk about harassment on social media. Is the cure for this worse than the disease? We're going to have some great guests on for there. Brianna Wu, Not So Erudite. Got a couple others in the works. It should be fun. Tuesday, we're having a debate on abortion. And it will be Pixie and Straighterade versus Lactoid and Jebtan. That should be fun. Wednesday, we're going to talk about harassment and sexism and racism and D&D and Dungeons and Dragons. Has Dungeons and Dragons gone woke? We're going to find out. And we might, I don't know if it's going to be this Thursday or not, but we are going to be talking about weaponization of the DOJ. We're going to have some great guests on for that. Pondering Politics will be there. Rob Noor will be there. We're trying to get a couple bigger names on this one, right? So we might have some people you haven't seen before, but we'll see. For that, I'm gonna say adios, and we're gonna rate out. Say hi to Stardust for me, gang. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye. Bye.
Thank you, Wick.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was very fun. I enjoyed it a lot.